Vernon Slade pressed Aurelia Fenwick's own ranch seal into the wax and handed the fraudulent documents to the banker without blinking while she was 300 miles away, trusting him with everything she had built over 11 years. He didn't forge her signature in desperation. He did it slowly, deliberately, with the patience of a man who had been planning this for a long time. By the time Aurelia rode back through Silver Basin, the gates of Golden Lark Ranch were padlocked. Her workers were gone. Her cattle carried someone else's brand. And the man she had trusted with her ledgers, her livestock, and her land was sitting behind her desk like he had always belonged there. She had $40 in her coat pocket and nowhere to sleep. If this kind of story moves something in you, the ones about people who lose everything, and refuse to stay down, subscribe to this channel right now and follow Aurelia's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning Aurelia Fenwick lost Golden Lark Ranch started the same way most disasters do, quietly, and without any warning she recognized in time. She had been away for 9 days. The cattle contract negotiations and billings had run longer than expected, dragged out by a buyer revising his numbers and a railroad agent who couldn't commit to a shipping date without consulting 3 different supervisors first. Aurelia had handled it. She always handled it. That was the reputation she had built over 11 years in Silver Basin Valley, that Aurelia Fenwick did not fold under pressure, did not accept bad terms, and did not let men talk her into deals that benefited only their side of the ledger. She had ridden out of billings with a signed contract, a fair price per head, and a shipping commitment that would carry Golden Lark through the following spring. She had been in a decent mood for the first time in weeks. The mood lasted until she reached the turnoff onto her own property and found the gate chained. Not stuck, not swollen shut from the rain, chained with a padlock she had never seen before, heavy and new, looped through iron rings that someone had installed while she was gone. There was a notice posted to the gate post, folded once and pinned with a nail. Aurelia sat on her horse for a moment, not understanding what she was looking at. She climbed down, pulled the notice free, and read it twice before the words actually reached her. It was a lien notice, filed at the county courthouse in her absence. It cited a debt of $11,400 owed by Aurelia Fenwick to the First Territorial Bank of Silver Basin, secured against Golden Lark Ranch and all associated property, water rights, livestock, and structures thereon. The notice stated that the property had been placed in receivership pending full satisfaction of the outstanding debt or legal transfer of title. The signature at the bottom of the originating documents, the signature that had apparently authorized a loan she had never applied for, was her own name, or something close enough to it that a county clerk who had never met her might not have questioned it. Aurelia stood at her own gate for a long time. The paper shook slightly in her hands. She told herself it was the wind. Then she heard boots on gravel. Vernon Slade came around the side of the gatehouse, a small structure she had built 3 years ago to house the man who managed the entrance at busy seasons. Vernon was wearing a clean shirt, which was unusual. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed what he planned to say and felt reasonably confident about it. Aurelia. He said her name the way men said it when they were reclaiming something flat, possessive, no greeting in it. Vernon. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Unlock this gate. Can't do that. I'm not asking. The property is in receivership. He folded his hands in front of him, a gesture she had never seen him make before. It made him look like a man imitating someone official. You know that. You can see it right there. The bank has an interest in this land now, and I've been retained to manage it during the proceedings. Retained. She repeated the word. By who? The bank. Weston Drury at the First Territorial. He needed someone already familiar with the operation. Aurelia looked at him. She had known Vernon Slade for 6 years. She had hired him when Golden Lark was smaller than it was now, promoted him when he proved useful, trusted him with the purchase books and the payroll ledger because he was good with numbers, and because she had genuinely believed that he was the kind of man who understood what loyalty to an employer meant. She realized, standing there, that she had been constructing that version of him entirely in her own head. I never took out a loan from Weston Drury, she said. I never signed any document authorizing a debt against this ranch. You know that, Vernon, because you kept the books. You know exactly what financial agreements exist against this property. The documents are on file at the courthouse. He didn't flinch. That was the thing that unsettled her most. He had always been a man with small flinches, a blink at a harsh word, a slight tightening around the eyes when challenged. Now there was nothing, just a kind of smooth patience she had never seen in him before. The clerk's office verified the signature. If you believe there's been an error, you're welcome to raise it through the proper legal channels. Where are my workers? Something crossed his face then. Not guilt, more like mild inconvenience at the question. Most of them have moved on. There wasn't need to keep the full payroll during the receivership period. The ones who stayed are being compensated by the bank. You dismissed my workers. The bank's property manager made that determination. You are not the bank's property manager. You are my ranch manager. You work for me. Not anymore, he said it simply, as if it were a fact about the weather. I'd suggest you get yourself into town, Aurelia. You've got some legal matters to sort out, and standing at that gate isn't going to move anything forward. She looked past him at the main house. The windows were lit. There was smoke from the chimney in the kitchen wing. Someone was inside cooking in her kitchen, moving through her rooms, sitting in the chairs she had bought, and the house she had expanded board by board over a decade. Those are my horses in that far paddock, she said. Those are livestock associated with the property currently in receivership. Vernon. Her voice dropped. It wasn't softness. It was the opposite, the thing underneath softness when softness has burned away. I built this ranch. I dug the well. I laid fence posts in ground so hard it broke 3 iron rods. I negotiated every water rights agreement in this county. Every acre on that deed I earned. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw something shift in him, not regret, not quite shame, but something like acknowledgement. A flicker of recognition that he was looking at the person who actually built what he was now standing inside. Then it closed back over, and the smooth patience returned. You should get yourself a lawyer, he said. You know where the town is. He turned around and walked back toward the gatehouse. Aurelia stood at the gate a while longer. She was not going to cry in front of a chained lock. She had made that decision before she even consciously made it. She folded the notice, put it in her coat pocket, and climbed back on her horse. She rode toward Silver Basin town without looking back at the property. Looking back would not help anything. She understood that in the way she understood cold weather, not something to negotiate with, just something to move through. The town received her the way towns receive a woman who has just publicly lost everything. Carefully. Chester Wayne at the general store was polite, but suddenly very interested in the grain display behind his counter. Ruth Alderman, who had come to Aurelia 3 years ago, needing help when her husband died and her son needed a job, crossed to the other side of the street. Not rudely, not obviously, just enough that Aurelia noticed it, which Ruth certainly knew she would. Heber Fose, the county attorney, was less polite than she had hoped. He reviewed the notice, leafed through the copies she had no access to but he had on file, and told her that the documents appeared to be in order. Appeared, she said, from a legal standpoint, without a challenge supported by contradicting evidence. He cleared his throat. The signature has been reviewed by the clerk's office. The clerk's office reviewed a signature on a document. They did not verify whether I actually signed it. Aurelia. He took off his glasses and set them on his desk in the particular way. Men set things down when they are about to say something they believe the other person won't be able to handle. Even if there are irregularities in how this was filed, and I'm not saying there are, Vernon Slade has the backing of the First Territorial Bank. Weston Drury has been the primary lender in this county for 15 years. You would be filing a challenge against a financial institution with established legal representation, against documents already on record, with forgive me no current assets to fund a prolonged dispute. I have water rights on the east parcel, she said. Vernon couldn't touch those because they're separately recorded. The parcel on the Bleecker Ridge line. Heber put his glasses back on. That property has no structures, no road access, and no productive use anyone in this county has ever found for it. It has 80 acres of rocks and scrub grass. Is it mine? He looked at the papers again. Technically, yes. It was recorded separately enough that it fell outside the receivership claim. Then I have land, she said, and I have a signed cattle contract in my bag from Billings that Vernon and your First Territorial Bank don't know about yet. And I have 11 years of knowing every agreement, every boundary dispute, every water access arrangement, and every legal filing in this county better than any manager who spent 6 years taking notes while I did the actual work. Heber Fossey looked at her the way people look at someone attempting something unlikely. What exactly are you planning to do? She wasn't sure yet. She didn't tell him that. She walked out of the attorney's office into the afternoon and stood on the boardwalk with the notice in her pocket. $43 in her coat, a horse and 80 acres of rocks and scrub grass that nobody wanted. She had been richer 3 weeks ago than most people in Silver Basin would ever be. She thought about that for approximately 30 seconds. Then she started trying to figure out what she was actually going to do. The problem with having nothing was that nothing moved very fast. She could ride out to the Bleecker Ridge parcel and look at it, which she did that afternoon, and what she found confirmed everything Heber Foss had implied. There was an old line cabin on the property, one she had used occasionally during fence riding seasons, and then mostly forgotten that had developed a dramatic lean in the east wall and appeared to have had a family of raccoons, living in the chimney for an indeterminate period. The barn structure nearby had partially collapsed on one side. The well had a broken pump assembly and what appeared to be years of debris in the shaft. She stood in the middle of those 80 acres and did the inventory honestly, the way she had always taught herself to do it. Not the inventory of what she wished were there, the inventory of what actually was. What actually was: one badly tilted cabin, one damaged barn, one broken well, 80 acres of land nobody had thought worth stealing, and a cattle contract that might eventually be worth something if she could find a way to actually fulfill it. What was not there? Workers, livestock, tools, money, usable shelter, and any clear immediate path from here to somewhere better. She was still standing in that calculation when she heard the wagon. It came along the ridge road slowly, the kind of slow that meant the horse pulling it was tired and the wagon was heavier than ideal. It was a battered thing, not dramatically battered. Not the wagon of a man who had given up on maintenance, but worn in the way that working equipment gets worn when it works constantly, and there isn't always money to replace what wears out. There were 3 children on the wagon bench and in the bed. The oldest, a boy of maybe 14, was driving with the particular focused competence of someone who had been doing it for a while. Beside him sat a girl younger than that, and in the wagon bed a very small child, a boy, maybe 6 or 7, was asleep against a flour sack. The man walking beside the wagon stopped when he saw Aurelia. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she guessed. Lean, the kind of lean that meant physical work rather than want, though she thought there might be some of the latter mixed in. He had a hat that had seen considerable weather and boots that were resoled at least once. He looked at her the way someone looks at another person when they're trying to quickly determine whether they're trouble. "Ma'am," he said. "Just passing through?" she asked. "Looking for work, mostly." He glanced at the leaning cabin. "That your place?" "It is." He looked at the cabin again, at the collapsed barn side, at the broken pump assembly visible near the wellhead. He looked at all of it without saying anything clever, which she appreciated. "Hard season?" he asked. Something in her chest compressed. "You could say that. I'm Garrick Boone." He didn't extend his hand across the distance, just offered the name. "Those are my children. Wes up front driving. That's Nell beside him, and the sleeping one is Perry. Aurelia Fenwick." He nodded once. He didn't react to the name. She didn't know yet whether that was because he genuinely hadn't heard the news circulating Silver Basin, or because he had heard it, and was choosing not to make it a thing. "You looking to work this parcel?" he asked. "I'm looking to survive it first," she said. "Then maybe work it." He looked at the cabin again, at the horizon, back at her. "Cabin needs that east wall braced before anything else," he said. "Otherwise, the whole lean gets worse when the ground freezes." "You get a hard freeze here?" "Every year." "Then that wall's the first thing." He said it the way someone states a sequence of tasks, not as a judgment of what had been allowed to happen, just as an observation about what needed to happen next. "Well, pump shaft that fixable, or is the casing cracked?" "I don't know yet." He nodded slowly. He looked at his children. The boy Wes was watching the exchange with the attentiveness of someone accustomed to reading situations quickly. The girl Nell was looking at the cabin with an expression Aurelia couldn't quite identify, not pity, something more practical than that. Garrick Boone turned back to Aurelia. "We don't have money," he said. It was a plain statement, offered without embarrassment. "I've got tools, a good horse, labor, and those 3. If you've got land and you're looking to put it to use, we might be able to work something out that benefits both sides." Aurelia looked at him. She had spent 11 years negotiating arrangements with ranchers, buyers, lenders, and railroad agents. She understood deals. She understood when a person's offer was honest and when it was the surface of something else. This man appeared to simply be telling her what he had and asking whether it was useful. "Where are you coming from?" she asked. "Wyoming." "Before that, Colorado." "You're moving around a lot." "Yes." She waited for more. He didn't offer it. "The children's mother?" she asked, because it was a practical question if she was going to make any kind of arrangement. "Died 2 years ago." He said it without the performance that question usually produced. Just a fact, placed down carefully. She looked at the 3 children. The sleeping one stirred in the wagon bed and resettled without waking. She thought about Heber Foss telling her she had 80 acres of rocks and scrub grass. She thought about Vernon Slade's hands folded in front of him like he was practicing authority. She thought about the $11,000 lien on her name and the forged signature and the padlocked gate and the $43 in her coat pocket. She thought about what Garrick Boone actually had to offer her, which was labor and tools and children. And then she thought about what she had to offer him, which was 80 acres nobody wanted, and a woman with 11 years of knowledge about how land worked and what it could produce if you approached it right. "That cabin," she said. "The lien isn't as bad as it looks. The foundation logs are still solid. The east wall is a frame problem, not a rot problem." "I figured," Garrick said. "The barn collapse is on the west section. The east section and the center are still structurally usable. Needs the roof cleared and shoring up, but the frame is there." "All right, the well," she paused. "I don't actually know the well. I never depended on it. There might be something there." "Might not," he nodded. "I can't pay you," she said. "Not now. Not anything reliable, I know that. And I'm in a legal dispute with a man who controls most of this valley and a banker with 15 years of influence in the county courthouse. Anything associated with me right now is associated with trouble." He looked at her steadily. "Ma'am, I've been moving from Wyoming to Colorado to Montana with 3 children and a wagon and no particular welcome anywhere. Trouble is pretty relative from where I'm standing." Something shifted in her chest that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite trust. It was the thing slightly before both of those, the recognition that you were looking at someone who might be useful and who seemed to be looking at you the same way. "There's no room in the cabin for all of us," she said. "We've slept in the wagon before. It'll be cold. We've managed cold." She looked at the wagon, at the sleeping child, at the girl Nell, who was now watching her, with an expression that was too perceptive for an 11-year-old. "Wes," she said, addressing the boy at the reins, "can you actually drive that team, or does your father do most of it?" The boy blinked, surprised at being addressed directly. "I drive it. Pa walks when the grade's hard to take weight off." "What do you know about horses?" He sat up slightly. "Most things." "Most things is not an answer. I know what a horse is telling you before it tells you," he said. "I know when something's wrong in the gait before it's wrong enough to see. I know the difference between a horse that's mean and a horse that's scared and how to handle both." She considered him. He was 14 maybe, and talking like someone who had been around horses long enough to stop being impressed by them, which was usually a reliable indicator. "The south corner of that field," she said, gesturing. "There were 2 mares running loose when I checked the property last fall. If they're still there, they've been unhandled for 8 months. I need to know what's there before I can do anything with them." Wes looked at the field. His expression wasn't eager, it was focused, which was better. "I can do that," he said. Aurelia looked at Garrick Boone. He was watching her with something that might have been quiet approval, or might have just been patience. She couldn't tell yet. "I don't know what this becomes," she said. "I'm telling you that plainly. I don't know if I can get the ranch back. I don't know if I can prove what Vernon did. I don't know if 80 acres with a broken well and a leaning cabin amounts to anything." "You know the land," Garrick said. "I know this county's land." "Yes. Then you know more than most people starting over have." He said it simply. Not as a comfort, as an assessment. She was not accustomed to people assessing her the way she assessed things. It was briefly disorienting. "The cabin first," she said. "Then the well. If the well has anything, we work from there." "That's what I said when I looked at it," he agreed. "I know, I'm saying I agree with you." She paused. "That may be an infrequent event going forward." The corner of his mouth moved. Almost a smile. "Not quite. I'll take what I can get," he said. She turned toward the cabin. Behind her, she heard the wagon creak as Garrick climbed up, spoke quietly to Wes, and the horse began pulling toward the broken-down structure that was all Shell had left. It was not, she thought, what she would have designed as a beginning. but Vernon Slade had not left her with many options. She pushed open the cabin door. It stuck, and she had to shove it with her shoulder and looked at the interior. The raccoons had been busy. There was debris in the corner, a rusted iron stove that had not been used in years, a floor that needed sweeping badly, and light coming through a gap in the east wall where the lean had opened a crack between the logs. Cold in winter, that crack. She would be feeling it soon. She heard small boots on the step behind her. She turned. Perry Boone, the youngest, had woken up from his nap in the wagon and apparently walked in behind her without being noticed. He was standing in the doorway of the cabin, looking around the interior with the serene curiosity of a 7-year-old who had no strong opinions about the quality of accommodations. "Is this where we live now?" he asked. "For now," she said. He considered that. Then he walked past her, went to the iron stove, and looked at it with great seriousness, as though evaluating it against some internal standard. "The stove is rusty," he observed. "I know, it might still work." Might. He nodded, satisfied with this ambiguity. Then he looked at the gap in the east wall. "That's a big crack," he said. "Yes. Papa can fix that. That's the plan." He looked up at her. He had his father's steadiness in the eyes, she noticed. Something settled there that you didn't usually see in a 7-year-old's face. "We had a house in Wyoming," he said, "before. It was bigger than this." She didn't know what to say to that. "This one's okay, though," he said, still looking around with that placid assessment. "You just got to fix the crack." She looked at the ruined cabin, at the crack in the east wall, at the raccoon debris in the corner and the rusted stove and the rotted floorboard near the window that would need replacing before anyone stepped on it. "Yeah," she said, "you just got to fix the crack." She had no idea, standing there, whether she could fix anything. But Perry Boone seemed entirely convinced the project was manageable. She supposed that was a starting point. Outside, she could hear Garrick Boone asking Wes about the tools in the wagon. She could hear Nell's voice clear and precise, cataloging something, and the sound of the wagon being unloaded with the efficient sound of a family that had done this before, in other places, starting over from other kinds of nothing. The afternoon light was going thin, and the temperature was dropping the way Montana temperatures dropped in September without apology, quickly, all at once. Aurelia Fenwick, who had owned one of the finest ranches in Silver Basin Valley that morning, added dry wood to a rusted stove in a leaning cabin on 80 acres of rock and scrub grass. The stove, as Perry had suggested it might, actually worked. That was something. She supposed she would find out whether something was enough. The stove burned through the night, but it wasn't enough to keep the cold out of the east wall crack. Aurelia woke before dawn with her coat pulled over her like a blanket and her breath making small clouds in the dark air above her face. The floorboards were hard. She had slept on harder things during fence riding seasons, but that was when she'd had a bedroll under her, and the knowledge that a real bed was waiting somewhere, at the end of it. This floor was the end of it, for now. She lay there for a moment, not moving, listening. Outside, she could hear wind working at the corner of the cabin. Through the gap in the east wall came a thin thread of cold air that touched the side of her neck no matter which way she turned. In the wagon outside, the Boone children were sleeping. She could hear nothing from that direction, which meant they were practiced at sleeping through cold, which meant they had done it enough times that it no longer disturbed them, which meant their lives had been harder than she had thought to ask about. She sat up. The iron stove had banked down to coals. She fed it 2 pieces of wood from the small stack. Garrick had cut the previous evening. He had done it without being asked, while there was still enough light to see the axe, and sat on her heels in front of it while the wood caught. She did not allow herself to think about the main house at Golden Lark, where the kitchen was 3 times the size of this entire cabin, and the stove was a proper cast-iron range that held heat through the night without attention. She had learned, very young, that comparing what you had to what you'd lost was a way of making yourself useless. Her mother had taught her that, and her mother had lost things that made Golden Lark look small. She thought instead about the well. The pump shaft had been cleared enough yesterday afternoon for Garrick to get a lantern down into the upper section, and what he'd seen was encouraging in the narrow sense of the word. No visible crack in the casing, no apparent cave-in, just years of debris, and a broken pump arm that had likely been broken before Aurelia ever bought this parcel in the first place. She had purchased the 80 acres 6 years ago for reasons that made sense at the time. The water rights attached to it gave her leverage in a boundary dispute with a neighboring rancher. She had won the dispute, filed the rights, and mostly forgotten the parcel existed, except as a line on the deed. Vernon had apparently forgotten it too. That oversight was the only reason she was not sleeping in her wagon right now, instead of on this floor. She heard the cabin door open and turned. Garrick Boone came in carrying a tin cup and crouching automatically to avoid the low doorframe, though he was not quite tall enough to need to. It was the habit of a man accustomed to ducking through doorways, which said something about the places he'd lived. He held the cup toward her. "Coffee," he said. She looked at it. "You have coffee?" "Half a pound left." He settled on his heels on the other side of the stove. Nell was up early. She made it on the campfire outside. Aurelia took the cup. It was real coffee, not the chicory substitute she had braced herself for, and it was hot, and she did not say anything for a moment because she was drinking it, and there was no reason to fill silence with words, just because it was there. "Well's got water," Garrick said. "I threw a rope down after you went in last night. Hit water at 31 feet. Not a lot of flow, but it's there." She lowered the cup. "You're sure?" Rope came back wet. "That's sure enough for now." He looked at the stove, not at her. "Pump arm's the problem. I can fabricate something if I can get to a blacksmith in town. Won't be pretty, but it'll move water." "Chester Wayne at the general store has a forge out back," she said. "He uses it for tools. He might let you use it if you ask without mentioning my name." Garrick glanced at her briefly. "That bad?" "Yesterday, Ruth Alderman crossed the street when she saw me coming." She said it without inflection. "Ruth's husband died 4 years ago, and I hired her son for 2 seasons when she had nothing." She crossed to the other side of the street. He was quiet for a moment. "People do that," he said, "when they're afraid. I know why they do it." She drank the rest of the coffee. "Doesn't make it sit better." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She handed him back the cup. Outside, she could hear Perry's voice. The boy was apparently awake and conducting some kind of conversation that did not seem to require another participant, which was consistent with what she had observed about him so far. "I need to talk to you about what we're actually doing here," she said. "All right, not the cabin and the well. Those are today's problems, and I understand today's problems." She looked at him directly, the way she had always addressed people she was entering an agreement with. "I mean the larger situation. Vernon Slade has control of Golden Lark Ranch. He obtained it through a forged debt document. He has the backing of Weston Drury at the First Territorial Bank. Both of those men have been established in this county for over a decade, and neither of them wants trouble." "But you're going to give them trouble," Garrick said. "Eventually, if I can find the grounds. But right now I have no money, no workers, no livestock, and no evidence beyond my own certainty that I never signed that document." She paused. "Which is worth exactly nothing in a courthouse." He nodded, following it. "What I do have is 80 acres with water under it," she said, "and a cattle contract from Billings that nobody knows about yet. The buyer agreed to take 300 head at $22 per head by the following May." Garrick did the arithmetic in his expression. "You don't have cattle." "I know I don't have cattle. May's 8 months." "I know when May is." He looked at her for a moment. She had the sense he was doing 2 kinds of calculation simultaneously, the practical one about numbers and time, and some other one that was less about math. "Cattle's not the first problem," he said. "First problem is getting this place producing enough that you have any standing to pursue the ranch legally. A man like Vernon Slade, he's waiting for you to make a move. If you move too soon with nothing behind you, he'll bury you in filings and you'll spend everything you've got on attorney fees before you get anywhere." She looked at him. "That is exactly right. So the land first." "The land first," she agreed. He was quiet again, the way he got quiet when he was thinking through something. Not the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of a man deciding how to say something he'd already worked out. "I've moved around a lot," he said, "since Mira died. Didn't see much point in staying anywhere." He looked at the stove. "The kids need something more than that. Wes is 14, and he's already spending more energy managing me than he ought to at his age." She didn't say anything, because she didn't know him well enough yet to say anything useful. "What I'm saying is," he continued, "I'm not looking for work I can leave in 3 months. If we're doing this, fixing this place, trying to make it amount to something, I need to know it's a real arrangement and not something that dissolves when your situation changes." "My situation may change significantly," she said. "I intend to get Golden Lark back. I know that. If I do, everything is different. I know that too." He looked at her. "I'm asking whether different means we're out." She considered it honestly. It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer, Not the kind of reassurance people offer when they want someone to stop asking. She had offered enough of that kind of reassurance in her life, and she knew what it cost later. "I don't know what it means yet," she said. "I can't promise you a future on land I don't control yet. What I can tell you is that I don't throw away things that work, and I don't forget what people put into something when it was hard." She paused. "That's the best I can give you right now." He nodded slowly. "That's honest. It's the only kind of answer I know how to give." The door opened again and Nell Boone came in, pulling it shut behind her with both hands against the wind. She was carrying a second tin cup and a folded cloth that turned out to contain 3 biscuits from last night's fire, slightly hard but intact. "Perry found something in the south field," she said, setting the biscuits on the floor near the stove. Wes went to look. Garrick was already standing. Aurelia was 2 steps behind him. What Perry had found, it turned out, was not a crisis, but was still significant. In the far corner of the south field, where the scrub grass grew thick along a fence line, so old it was barely recognizable as fence anymore, 2 mares stood watching the approaching humans with the wariness of animals that had been managing without people for a while. They were thin not dangerously, but noticeably, and the winter coat was coming in rough on both of them. One was a dark bay with a white stocking on the left fore. The other was a gray that had probably been prettier before 8 months, without proper feed. Wes was standing about 15 feet from them, completely still, his hands loose at his sides. He had not approached them. He was just standing there, letting them look at him, which was exactly correct. Aurelia stood beside Garrick and watched her son work, because that was clearly what it was work, practiced and deliberate. "The bay's the nervous one," Wes said without turning. He kept his voice low and conversational, like he was discussing the weather. "She's been watching me since I was still by the fence. The gray doesn't know what to think yet." "How long have you been standing there?" Garrick asked. "Maybe 10 minutes. He shifted his weight slightly, just a little, to give the horses something to track. The bay's ears moved. "She's deciding." Perry was sitting on the fence rail behind them, watching his brother with the serene attention of a child who had seen this before and knew to be quiet. Aurelia watched the bay mare. The horse's ears cycled forward, sideways, forward again. Her hindquarters were tense, but she hadn't moved her feet, which was telling. A horse that was truly going to bolt had already shifted its weight back by now. "She's been without people," Aurelia said quietly, "but she wasn't born wild. Look at the line of that neck that's breeding." Somebody raised her. Wes glanced back at her, briefly, surprised, and she saw in his face the particular expression of someone who has just discovered another person speaks their language. "That's what I thought," he said. "Gray, too. They're not spooked. They're just out of practice with us," Aurelia said. "Yeah." He turned back to the horses. "Exactly." It took another 20 minutes, and it did not end with Wes walking up and putting his hand on the bay's neck in some triumphant gesture. What actually happened was the gray took 3 steps toward him out of curiosity, stopped, and Wes sat down in the grass without making a thing of it, and eventually the gray came close enough to smell his hat, which she then bit. Wes said a word Aurelia suspected he'd learned from his father, and Garrick said his name once in warning. And Perry fell off the fence rail laughing, and everyone looked at him, including the horses, and somehow the sudden noise and commotion resolved into the bay mare walking over to see what had happened, and Wes ended up sitting in the cold grass with 2 horses breathing on him. Not a triumph. A beginning. Back at the cabin, while the horses grazed cautiously within sight, Aurelia sat with Garrick and worked through what they actually had to work with. It was a conversation she approached the way she had always approached ledger work, without sentiment, with the understanding that false numbers didn't become true just because you wanted them to. They had the cabin, which needed the east wall braced, the floor repaired in 2 sections, and the chimney cleaned. Garrick could do the bracing today, if they had the right lumber, which they didn't. There was usable timber in the collapsed section of the barn, which could be salvaged. That was 2 days of work, at minimum, if he had Wes helping. They had the well, which had water but no functional pump. The fabricated replacement would not be fast. They had 2 mares in uncertain condition. They had no saddles, no tack suitable for the mares, and no feed beyond what the scrub field offered, which was not going to be sufficient once the cold settled in. They had $43. "What does a load of hay run in town?" Garrick asked. $2.50 a ton, usually. "Cheaper if you buy in bulk, which we cannot afford to do. Grain, more than hay." She rubbed the side of her face. "The horses are the first priority after the well." If we can get those mares in workable condition, we have something tradable. The bay in particular that's quality stock, even in the state she's in. Wes can work them, Garrick said. I know he can. I watched him this morning. She paused. He's good. He's better than good. He said it without the pride that most fathers would have put in it, which made it more credible. He's been the main person with horses since he was 10. Mira used to say it wasn't normal how easy it was for him. It's not normal, she agreed. There was a pause. Outside, she could hear Nell's voice. The girl had apparently decided to investigate the vegetable patch along the south side of the cabin, an area so overgrown with dead stalks and weeds that Aurelia had barely registered it as a deliberate structure. But Nell was pulling things apart with focused energy, and from what Aurelia could hear, conducting a systematic assessment of what was there. Your daughter, Aurelia said. She's organized. She keeps books, Garrick said. She keeps a ledger of everywhere we've been. What we spent, what we earned, what we're owed. Started it herself when she was 9. I didn't ask her to. Aurelia turned that over in her mind. Show me. He looked at her. The ledger. I want to see how she keeps it. He went out and came back with a cloth-wrapped notebook, somewhat battered, and handed it to her. She opened it. The handwriting was small and consistent, and the columns were precise. Date, location, income source, amount, expenditure category, amount, running balance. Notes in the margin when something required explanation. The totals checked out. She ran them in her head quickly, and the notation system was logical and consistent. No wasted space, no decorative elements, just clear functional record-keeping. The kind of ledger a person learned to keep by caring about what it tracked. Nell, she called. The girl appeared in the doorway, still holding a handful of dead plant stalks. Yes, ma'am? Come here. Nell came in and stood in front of her, looking at her own ledger in Aurelia's hands with an expression that was somewhere between territorial and curious. You balance these yourself? Aurelia asked. Yes, ma'am. Who taught you the column method? I looked at a store ledger once. In Colorado. The storekeeper let me look because I asked. She paused. I changed how he organized it because his way made it harder to find things. He was annoyed at first. Was he right to be annoyed? Nell thought about it with genuine seriousness. Probably a little. It wasn't my ledger. But my way was better. Aurelia handed the notebook back. I kept Golden Lark's books myself for 7 years before I hired a bookkeeper. I used a similar column structure. She looked at the girl. I'm going to need someone to track what we spend and earn on this place. Every dollar. Every trade. Everything. Nell looked at the ledger, then at Aurelia. I can do that. It's not small work. If we're keeping accurate records, and something goes to a courthouse later, those records have to be right. Not approximately right. Actually right. I know the difference, Nell said. Garrick made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. All right, Aurelia said. You'll start today. I'll show you the categories we need. Nell nodded once, sharp and satisfied, and went back outside to her vegetable investigation. The work that followed in the next weeks was not the kind that looked impressive from the outside. There was no dramatic single moment where everything changed. There was just day after day of small grinding effort that occasionally produced something real. Garrick and Wes salvaged timber from the collapsed barn section and used it to brace the east wall of the cabin. The work took 3 days, not 2, because the first brace shifted under pressure and had to be redone. And when Garrick came inside that evening, he was short-tempered in the specific way of a man who did not like making the same mistake twice. And he snapped at Wes over something small, and Wes went quiet in the way of a 14-year-old who had learned that sometimes you waited it out. Aurelia, who had been working on the stovepipe replacement in the next room and heard it, did not intervene. Later she said to Garrick, he was right about the brace angle. I know he was right. Garrick was cleaning tool handles at the rough table they'd assembled from salvage. I know. He's going to push back on you more as he gets older, she said. The ones who are capable do. Is that from experience? I pushed back on my father until he either admitted I was right or gave me a reason to believe he wasn't, which he couldn't always do. She set down the section of stovepipe she'd been fitting. It made things difficult. It also made the ranch what it was. Garrick was quiet for a moment. His mother used to say the same thing about Wes. He looked at the table, that he was going to be better at most things than I was, and I needed to make peace with that before it became a problem between us. Smart woman. The smartest person I've ever known. He said it matter-of-factly. Not even close. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. The pump arm fabrication required a trip to town that Aurelia did not make. Garrick went alone, at her suggestion, and negotiated use of Chester Wayne's forge for $2, which was 43 cents more than they could comfortably afford, but less than it would cost to let the well stay broken. The arm he made was ugly, asymmetric, and worked beautifully. When it drew the first full bucket of water from the Bleecker Ridge well, Nell wrote the date in the ledger with a notation that said, simply, water running. Perry celebrated by immediately getting his sleeve soaked, which he appeared to consider a satisfactory outcome. The mares improved. Wes worked them daily, never rushing, never forcing, approaching each session as a conversation he was willing to have on the horse's terms. The bay, who Wes had named Cassidy despite Aurelia's position that naming horses you might need to sell was poor strategy, began allowing herself to be groomed within 10 days. The gray took longer. The gray had opinions. Aurelia worked alongside Wes more than she had intended. She had meant to focus on the legal situation, on building the case against Vernon, on gathering any evidence she could reach without money or access. But the horses kept pulling her back because she understood horses in the same bone-deep way Wes did. And working alongside him was oddly easy in the way that working alongside someone who operates on the same frame frequency is always easy regardless of everything else that separates you. Your father said you've been the main person with horses since you were 10, she said one morning while she was running her hand down Cassidy's left foreleg, checking for heat in the joint. Pa's better with cattle, Wes said. He was working a brush along the gray's shoulder, slow and rhythmic. He knows horses fine, but cattle is where he thinks in his sleep. What happened to the cattle you had? Wes was quiet for a moment. We had a small place outside Laramie. 8 head. When Mama died, Pa, he stopped, reorganized. He wasn't for a while. The place slipped. By the time he came back to himself, we'd lost most of what we'd built. He kept the brush moving. He blames himself for it. More than he should. Aurelia didn't press it. She checked the other foreleg, found nothing concerning, and stood up. He doesn't treat you like a ranch hand, she said. He asks your opinion before he makes decisions. He's always done that. Not every father does. Wes glanced at her briefly, then back to the gray. He says he doesn't have the right to make decisions that affect us, without asking us what we think about them. Because they're our lives too. He paused. He started saying that after Mama died. Before that, I think he just kind of assumed we'd follow whatever he decided. Which we would have. But after he changed that, she thought about that. About what loss did to a person's understanding of how much time they assumed they had to do better. It was late October when Vernon Slade's first move came, and it came sideways, the way Vernon did everything. Aurelia was in town at the attorney's office, not Heber Foss, who had made his position clear, but a different man, Clement Price, who ran a modest practice out of a single room above the saddle shop, and who had a reputation for taking cases that other attorneys found inconvenient. She was laying out her situation for him, methodically, with the dates and document numbers she had memorized. Clement Price was a small man with the kind of face that revealed nothing unless you watched it carefully, and she was watching it carefully. The timing problem, she said, is here. She pointed at her notes. The document dated March 14th. I was in Billings from March 10th through March 19th. I have a hotel receipt, a record of a purchase at a trading company, and I can name 6 people who saw me there. Can those people be reached? Some of them. The hotel ledger is a matter of record. Ledgers can be questioned. People who saw me can't be questioned. They saw what they saw. She kept her voice level. The signature on that debt document was not made by me. Price looked at his desk for a moment. If the bank's attorneys argue the signature is genuine, you're in a position where a handwriting dispute could go either direction. Those things are not clean. I know they're not clean. She leaned forward slightly. I'm not asking you whether this is easy. I'm asking you whether the case has grounds. He looked up at her. It has grounds, he said. Shaky grounds and expensive ones, and grounds that Vernon Slade and Weston Drury's attorneys will contest at every step. He paused. But grounds. What do you need from me to begin? A retainer. He named a number that was more than she had. I don't have that now, she said. I have land. I have documented water rights. I have 2 mares in improving condition, and a cattle contract from Billings that represents eventual income. She met his eyes. I also have the fact that if I win this, Golden Lark Ranch is reinstated in my name, and you will have been the attorney who took on the case when nobody else would. He looked at her steadily. That's a substantial risk for me. Yes, she said, it is. I am aware of that. He tapped his fingers once on the desk and stopped. I'll need to see the contract from Billings. I have it here. He read it. She watched his face do the careful thing it did when he was calculating. This is a valid contract, he said. Yes, 300 head by May, which I don't have yet, she said, but which I intend to have. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put the contract down and said, I'll start the preliminary filing. No guarantee of outcome. This could take a year or more. I know. Vernon Slade will know within a week that you filed. I expect that. He'll push back. I know he will. She rode back to the Bleecker parcel in the cold afternoon, with the feeling that she had just lit something she couldn't unlight, which was the idea. But there was no comfort in it. There was just the awareness that things were in motion now, and motion once started had its own logic that didn't always care what you intended. Garrick was patching the barn roof when she rode in. He climbed down when he saw her expression. Well, he said, I filed. She dismounted and handed off the horse. Price is starting the preliminary work. He looked at her. How'd he feel about it? Cautious, but not against it. She looked at the barn. The work he'd done on it was visible and solid, the east sections standing straight now where they'd been sagging before. Vernon's going to find out within the week. Garrick nodded slowly. Then we better have something to show when he does. She looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, when a man like Vernon Slade finds out you've filed against him, his first move is going to be to make you look small. Make it look like whatever you're doing out here is nothing. He tilted his head toward the barn, the cabin, the field, where the two mares were visible. I want it to look like something when he looks this way. She thought about that. It was not a legal strategy. It was a different kind of strategy, the kind that operated in the area of what people believed about you, which was its own territory with its own rules. What are you thinking? She asked. I'm thinking we need a third mare and a decent fence line before the ground freezes, he said. And I'm thinking I know someone in the next county who owes me a debt that he'd settle in livestock if I asked the right way. She looked at him. You have a contact who'd give you a horse. One horse. Probably not quality stock. One more horse is still one more horse, she calculated quickly. If we can get the pen finished and have 3 animals in workable condition before the month's out. People in town would see something worth noticing, he said. Yes, she paused. When were you planning to mention this contact? When it seemed relevant. He picked up the hammer he'd set down. It just seemed relevant. She thought about saying something about the usefulness of sharing information in advance. But she also recognizes that Garrick Boone operated on the principle of not offering things until they had a reasonable chance of being real, which was actually a principle she respected even when it inconvenienced her. Go tomorrow, she said. Take Wes. 2 people traveling are less likely to come back empty-handed. He nodded. I was going to say the same thing. That evening, while Garrick and Wes went over the route to the next county and Nell updated the ledger by firelight, Perry found Aurelia sitting outside the cabin in the cold, looking toward where the light from Golden Lark's main house was barely visible on the far ridge. She didn't hear him come up until he was standing beside her. He looked in the same direction she was looking. Is that your other house? He said. It was. Are you going to get it back? She considered giving him the careful answer, the one with appropriate uncertainty. Then she looked at him 7 years old, standing in Montana cold without complaint, asking her a direct question the way all of the Boones seemed to ask direct questions when they wanted to know something. Yes, she said. He nodded as though that settled it. Wes says the gray mare is going to be the better horse once she figures out she can trust people, he said. He might be right. He usually is about horses. He stuffed his hands in his coat pockets. Nell says we've spent $14 and we've still got 29 left. 29 and a few cents. Nell counts the cents too. Good. Cents matter. Perry appeared to find this philosophically satisfying. He stood there a while longer, looking at the distant light on the ridge, then looked up at Aurelia. If you get your big ranch back, he said, does that mean we have to leave? The question was so plainly asked, with so little drama behind it, that she didn't immediately have an answer. Where did that come from? She asked. He shrugged one shoulder. Nell worries about it. She doesn't say so, but I can tell. Aurelia looked at the Lark Ridge lights again, at the property that had been hers, at the long, cold distance between here and there. Tell Nell, she said, that I don't make decisions about people's lives without talking to them first. Perry considered this. That's not exactly an answer, he said. You're 7, she said. It's the answer you get. He looked at her for another moment with that unreadable Boone steadiness. Then he said, okay, and walked back inside, apparently satisfied with something in the exchange that she herself wasn't entirely sure she understood. The cold came in hard that night, and in the morning there was frost on everything, and the well pump arm moved stiffly until it warmed, and the bay mare Cassidy pressed her nose against the fence rail and breathed out a long visible cloud into the sharp air. And Aurelia stood in the yard of the 80-acre property that nobody had thought worth stealing and looked at what 6 weeks of work looked like. It wasn't much, but it was there, and it was real, and it was theirs in the way that things you build yourself are yours, in a way that inherited things never quite are. She went inside and told Nell to open a new section in the ledger. What for? Nell asked. Horse income, Aurelia said. We're going to need the column. Nell opened to a fresh page and wrote the heading without asking any more questions, which was one of the things Aurelia was coming to appreciate most about her. Clement Price's preliminary filing reached the county courthouse on a Thursday, and by Friday morning Vernon Slade knew about it. Aurelia had expected that. What she had not fully anticipated was how fast the response would come, or what shape it would take. She found out the shape on Saturday, when she rode into Silver Basin for supplies, and discovered that Chester Wayne's general store would no longer extend her credit. Not hostile about it, Chester was not a hostile man, which made it worse in some ways. He stood behind his counter, with the look of someone who had made a decision he didn't entirely like, and had decided the best way through it was to keep his voice pleasant. I'm sorry, Aurelia, he said. I've got my own obligations. To who? He looked at the counter. The First Territorial holds the paper on this building. Has for 3 years. A pause. Weston Drury sent a man around yesterday. She stood at his counter for a moment. She bought what she could pay cash for salt, a small tin of lamp oil, 2 pounds of dried beans, and walked out without saying anything else, because there was nothing else to say to Chester Wayne that would accomplish anything. He was not her enemy. He was a man caught between pressures he hadn't chosen, doing the calculation every small businessman in a company bank county eventually had to do. She did the same calculation herself, writing back. How many businesses in Silver Basin held paper with the First Territorial? How many of those Weston Drury could pressure with a single conversation? How quickly Vernon could make an entire town's economy close around her like a fist, faster than she'd thought, apparently. When she got back to the property, Garrick was repairing a section of fence along the north side of the field. He looked at her face when she dismounted and set down the tools he'd been working with. What happened? He said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the consistent things about him. He did not interrupt when someone was explaining something, even when he had already seen where it was going. Drury moved fast, he said when she finished. Vernon moved fast. Drury signed off on it. She tied her horse to the post. He's cutting off the credit lines first. It's a pressure play he wants to make this uncomfortable enough that I drop the filing. Will it work? Not if I don't let it. She looked at the fence line he'd been working on. It was solid work, the posts were true, and the wire was taut without being overtensioned. But it limits us. I was planning to buy grain on credit before the full cold set in. Without that, the horses are carrying more risk through winter. Garrick thought for a moment. How much grain are we talking about? Enough for 3 horses through January, minimum. February if we can manage it. She calculated. Call it $8. We have 11 left in the ledger. I know what we have in the ledger. She said it more sharply than she intended. He didn't react, which she appreciated. $8 on grain means $3 for everything else through January. That's not a margin. That's a thread. Then we find another way to get grain, he said. Chester's not the only supply source in the county, she said, but he's the closest and the cheapest. The next nearest is Fogarty's in Millhaven, which is 11 miles, and Fogarty charges 15% more than Chester because he knows he has the distance advantage. She sat on the fence rail, not caring about the cold wood. And if Drury has moved on Chester, he may have moved on Fogarty too. Garrick was quiet. His jaw moved slightly the way it did when he was working through something he didn't like. I'll go to Millhaven, he said. By myself, early, before word travels if it hasn't already. Cash only. Even at Fogarty's prices, we can get enough grain to carry the horses if we're careful. It leaves us $2. I know it does. She looked at him. He looked back, and the exchange was brief and did not have sentiment in it. Just two people It's two people acknowledging that they were in a narrow place and had already agreed they were going to stay in it. Go tomorrow, she said, early. He nodded and picked up his tools. She sat on the fence a moment longer, looking toward where Golden Lark's outbuildings were visible in the far distance. She could not actually see the main house from here, just the tops of the large hay storage structure Vernon had built, the year before built with her money, her approval, her signature on the lumber order. She thought about the signature. Every time she got to that thought, the forged signature, the document, the timing, she felt the same thing, not rage exactly, but a cold, focused anger that was more useful than rage because it did not make her impulsive. Vernon had sat across from her for 6 years. He had eaten meals in her kitchen. He had held her keys and her ledgers and her trust, and he had used all of it to build something she was still only partly able to see the full shape of. He had planned this, not quickly, over time, which meant there were traces. Planning left traces. She just needed to find them. That evening, she asked Nell to bring her the ledger, and they sat together at the rough table by the stove. It was a thing that had become a kind of routine over the previous weeks without either of them formally establishing it, Aurelia reviewing the day's entries, sometimes adding context about why a particular expenditure mattered. Nell asking precise questions about categories and valuations. The water rights, Nell said, running her finger along a notation she'd made earlier. I wrote them down as an asset, but I don't know how to value them. In cash terms, they're worth whatever someone would pay for them. Aurelia turned the page. But their practical value right now is leverage, not income. Vernon needs legal water access for Golden Lark's southern pasture before summer. Without it, that pasture becomes nearly useless in a dry year, and this county has been dry. Nell looked at the notation. So the water rights are more valuable than they look in the ledger. Considerably. Then they should be listed differently. Nell chewed the end of her pencil, something she did when she was thinking through a problem that she was mildly offended by. In the ledger, I have them as a fixed asset, same as the cabin. But they're more like they're a negotiating position. Yes, that's not a ledger category. No, Aurelia agreed. It isn't. But write a note in the margin. Something like strategic value exceeds recorded value. Anyone reading this later will understand what it means. Nell made the notation carefully, then looked up. Is that what Vernon wants? The water rights? Among other things. But yes, he took the ranch believing the water rights on this parcel were dormant, that I'd never developed this land. So the rights must not amount to much. She paused. He was wrong. I recorded those rights specifically because they feed a spring that runs under the southern edge of Golden Lark's grazing land. Vernon doesn't fully understand that yet, but he'll figure it out. Nell was quiet for a moment. When he does, he'll come with an offer or pressure. One of the two. What do we do? Aurelia looked at the girl across the rough table, at the careful ledger and the pencil with the chewed end and the expression that was, in that moment, not 11 years old at all, but just sharp and clear and paying attention. We make sure we're not desperate by then, she said. Garrick returned from Millhaven the next afternoon with grain enough for 6 weeks at careful ration and 2 pieces of information. The first was that Fogarty had not yet received any communication from Drury, which meant either Vernon was being selective about which businesses he pressured, or Fogarty simply wasn't significant enough to bother with. The second piece of information was that he had run into a man on the Millhaven Road named Cal Sutter, who turned out to be the bookkeeper Aurelia had employed at Golden Lark for 2 seasons before she had let him go the previous spring. Not fired, Garrick clarified. You let him go because you were managing the books yourself again. That's right. Cal's a decent man. Why were you talking to him? He approached me. Garrick was unloading the grain bags from the wagon, stacking them inside the barn with the efficiency of someone who was also thinking while he worked. He knew who I was. Apparently people in Millhaven have been hearing things about what's happening here, about you and the parcel and the filing. He asked after you. What did he say? Garrick set down the last bag and turned. His expression was careful, in a way that meant he was choosing words. He said he still had some records from his time at Golden Lark. Personal copies he made during his last weeks there, because something felt off to him in the ledger entries Vernon was giving him to reconcile. He didn't know what, exactly, but the numbers had a particular kind of wrong to them, that he recognized from a situation earlier in his life that he didn't go into detail about. He paused. He's been sitting on those copies because he didn't know what to do with them. Aurelia went very still. Records, she said. He said ledger pages mostly. Some purchase orders. He wasn't sure if they amounted to anything. She looked at him for a moment. Did you ask him to come talk to me? I told him where we were and said the decision was his. Garrick leaned against the barn frame. He's afraid, Aurelia. He knows who Vernon is and who Drury is and what they're capable of when someone inconveniences them. Can you blame him? No, but he's also clearly been bothered by sitting on this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have stopped to talk to a stranger on the road. She stood in the cold barn with the grain bags and thought about Cal Sutter, who had always been a quiet man, careful with numbers, slightly nervous in temperament, but not dishonest. She had always known he was not dishonest, which was why she had trusted him with the books in the first place. A man with possibly inconvenient records, sitting alone with them being bothered. Tell Wes to have Cassidy ready in the morning, she said. I'm going to Millhaven. She met Cal Sutter at a small cafe on Millhaven's single commercial street, at a corner table he had clearly chosen for its sightlines to both doors, which told her he was more afraid than Garrick had indicated. He was a thin man in his 40s, with the look of someone who had been worrying about something for long enough that it had changed the set of his face permanently. He had a cloth satchel on the seat beside him, and he did not put it on the table when she sat down. I wasn't sure you'd come yourself, he said. Who else would I send? He looked at his coffee. The man you're staying with, maybe. Garrick's not my representative. She paused briefly at the question of what exactly to call Garrick Boone, because the word partner implied equal legal standing, and the word friend implied something more mutual than what they had established, which was something practical and honest and not yet named. He works the land with me, she said. Cal nodded, apparently finding this sufficient. Tell me about the records, she said. He picked up a coffee cup, set it down without drinking. When I was keeping the Golden Lark books, Vernon was the one who gave me the source documents, purchase receipts, expense vouchers, payment records. My job was to reconcile them against the operating ledger. He paused. About 6 months before you let me go, I started noticing inconsistencies. Small ones at first. Purchase dates that didn't line up with delivery records. Payment amounts that were slightly off from what the vouchers said. He looked at his hands. I thought at first I was making errors, so I went back and checked my work. I wasn't making errors. What were the amounts? Small. That was the thing that was most wrong about it. If someone is stealing from an operation the size of Golden Lark, and I'm not saying that's what this was, I don't know. Cal, he looked up. Tell me what you saw, she said. He took a breath. If someone is siphoning money from an operation, they usually take enough to matter. These amounts were so small I almost didn't notice them. $5 here, $8 there, adjusted in columns that most people wouldn't look at twice. He finally drank his coffee. But they were going somewhere that wasn't in the ledger. And the accumulation over the months I tracked it was closer to $800. Aurelia sat with that for a moment. What were the documents being adjusted? Mostly equipment expenses and feed costs. Categories with enough natural variation that small changes could be explained away. He reached for the satchel. I made copies of 15 pages, the ones where the discrepancy was clearest. He set the satchel on the table but didn't open it yet. I want you to understand that I don't know for certain what this means. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if it proves anything. Let me see them. He opened the satchel and laid the papers on the table between them. She recognized the Golden Lark ledger format. Immediately, she had designed it herself 7 years ago. The column headers, the notation system, the page structure. She went through the pages slowly, the way she always read numbers, not for the surface, but for the pattern underneath. Cal had been right. The adjustments were small and placed in the correct columns to minimize visibility. But what he had either missed or not mentioned was something she noticed on the fourth page. The handwriting on the adjustment notations was different from the handwriting on the original entries. Not dramatically different, subtly different. The particular way a 2 was formed, the spacing between digits. Vernon's handwriting in the adjustments. Cal's handwriting in the original entries. These adjustments were made after you recorded the original entries, she said. Cal went still. How can you tell? I've looked at Vernon's handwriting for 6 years. And yours? She pointed to the specific numerals. These changes are his, not yours. He leaned in and looked. She watched his face as he saw what she was seeing. He altered my records, Cal said. It came out quiet and slightly stunned, like someone absorbing an insult after the fact. He went back into my work and altered it. To build a pattern, she said. A paper trail of financial irregularities he could eventually use to claim the ranch was operating at a loss greater than it appeared, which would support the debt claim. She was thinking through it as she spoke. He didn't forge the debt document in isolation. He built a foundation first. Small adjustments over months, creating a version of Golden Lark's finances that matched the story he wanted to tell. Cal was looking at the papers with an expression she recognized, a man realizing that what he thought was an abstract worry had always been something real. "If I testify to this," he said, "if I say what I saw, you'd be testifying against Vernon Slade and the First Territorial Bank." "I know," he sat with that. "I have a family in Millhaven. My wife's sister lives here. My children go to school here." "I know." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the cafe window, Millhaven Street went about its business in the cold morning. "What happens if I don't?" he finally asked. She looked at him. "Vernon keeps Golden Lark. Weston Drury keeps the paper on every business in this county. And anyone who worked at Golden Lark and saw what you saw goes on, quietly knowing it and saying nothing, and nothing changes, and eventually it becomes just a thing that happened." He looked at his coffee. "I'll talk to your attorney," he said. "I'm not promising testimony yet, but I'll talk to him." She rode back to the Bleecker parcel with the copies in her saddlebag, and the cold working through her coat, and the very specific feeling of something having shifted, not resolved, not won, just shifted, the way a heavy object moves when you find the right angle to push from. She found the property not quiet, as she had left it, but with an unfamiliar horse tied to the fence post, and Garrick standing outside the cabin door, with his arms crossed in the way he crossed them when he was being careful about something. She dismounted. "Who's inside?" "Man named Aldous Prine. Says he represents Vernon Slade." A pause. "He's been here about 40 minutes. I told him I didn't know when you'd be back." She handed her horse's reins to Garrick and walked inside. Aldous Prine was a large man in an expensive who had been given one of the cabin's 2 chairs and was clearly not comfortable in it, which was fine because she had not invited him. He was somewhere in his 50s, with the look of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in a room and mildly irritated when that wasn't immediately acknowledged. He stood when she came in, which she did not wait for before speaking. "Mr. Prine, Miss Fenwick." He adjusted his coat. "I represent Vernon Slade in his current capacity managing the Golden Lark Ranch property. I've come to—" "I know why you've come," she said. She went to the stove and checked the fire, adding a piece of wood, taking a moment she did not particularly need, but that established without discussion that she was in her own space, and he was a visitor in it. "He sent you because I filed with Clement Price, and he wants to know how serious I am." Prine blinked once. "He sent me to discuss a possible resolutions." "He sent you to offer me money to go away," she said. She turned and looked at him directly. "How much?" He was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. "Mr. Slade is prepared to offer a settlement of $3,000. "No." "Miss Fenwick, I've not finished." "The answer is no regardless of how you finish." She kept her voice entirely level. "The ranch is mine, the debt is fraudulent, and the settlement you're offering would require me to sign a document releasing any legal claim against the current receivership arrangement, which would make the fraud permanent and legally clean." She looked at him. "I'm not signing that." Prine looked at her for a long moment. He was, she thought, a man who had come in expecting a woman who had been frightened and pressured and slowly starved resources for 2 months, and who was finding something different. "Mr. Slade has been generous. Mr. Slade forged my signature on a loan document I never authorized." She said it plainly, without anger, the way you state a fact about the weather. "Anything he offers me is from a position of having taken something that was not his. There's no generosity in returning a fraction of what you stole." Prine said nothing. "Tell him no," she said. "And tell him that I've been speaking with people who worked at Golden Lark and have an interest in setting the record straight." She watched that land on Prine's face. It landed carefully. He was a professional. He did not visibly react, but she saw it touch something behind his eyes, and that something was not entirely certain. He left 10 minutes later without saying much else. Garrick came inside after the sound of Prine's horse faded. "3,000, he said. "Yes, you said no, obviously." He sat down in the chair Prine had vacated. "He's going to push back now. Harder than the credit lines." "I know." She leaned against the wall. Outside she could hear Nell's voice and Perry's, the two of them apparently in some discussion about the vegetable patch that Nell was attempting to winterize. "He sent an attorney this time. Next time he might not bother. Garrick looked at the stove. What did you find in Millhaven? She told him about Cal, about the ledger pages, about the handwriting. He listened with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Is it enough, he asked, for a courthouse? Maybe. Combined with the timeline evidence where I was, when the signature was supposedly made, it's the beginning of a case. She paused. But Cal is afraid, and I can't force him to testify. You wouldn't try to force him, no. But I need him. She looked at her hands. They were rougher than they had been 2 months ago. From the work, from the cold. She noticed things like that occasionally and filed them away as information about what her life currently was. And Vern is going to figure out very quickly that I have something, even if he doesn't know what it is. 3 days later, the next move came, and it was not an attorney. 2 men rode onto the Bleecker parcel on a gray afternoon, when the sky had the particular flat white color that in Montana meant serious weather was building somewhere not far away. They came without announcement and stopped their horses at the edge of the working yard. Wes saw them from the barn and came to the door without coming out. He had developed an instinct for reading situations that Aurelia had noticed before, and was noticing again now. The boy read the yard, read the men, read the angles, and stayed where he had cover and visibility both. She came out of the cabin when she heard the horses. The 2 men were not local. She didn't recognize either face, and she knew most faces in Silver Basin. They had the look of men hired for a specific purpose and not particularly interested in disguising that fact. Aurelia Fenwick? The nearer one said. Yes, we represent an interest in the county water rights situation. He said it with the particular blankness of someone reciting language they had been given. There's been a survey question raised about the exact boundary of the Bleecker parcel's recorded water access. The survey may indicate that the spring your rights claim falls outside your recorded boundary. She looked at him. There has been no survey question raised. I filed those water rights 6 years ago, and they have not been contested. A new assessment has been requested. By who? He looked at his companion briefly. That's a matter of public filing. Then I'll read it in the public filing. She stood in the yard without stepping back. Was there something else? The second man, who had not spoken, looked at the barn, at the fence line, at the winter-thin field with the 3 mares visible. He looked at all of it, the way someone looks at something they are considering for a different purpose. Nice work on this place, he said, considering where it started. She understood the statement for what it was, not a compliment, but an observation. The kind meant to communicate that someone had been watching, that the watching had been deliberate, and that whoever sent these men knew exactly what was on this property and how much it mattered to the people working it. Thank you, she said. She stood in the yard and watched them ride out. When they were gone, she turned and found Garrick standing in the barn doorway beside Wes, both of them having come out when the men left. The water rights, Garrick said. He's going to contest them, she said, or try to create the appearance of a contest to slow down the legal process. She walked to the fence. The bay mare, Cassidy, had come to the fence line with the horse's habitual curiosity, and Aurelia put her hand on the animal's nose without thinking about it. If he clouds the water rights question in filings, it delays everything. More importantly, it runs up my legal costs. And we've got $2 and some cents, Wes said. He said it without accusation, just as the fact that it was. Approximately, Aurelia said. They stood there in the cold yard, the 3 of them, and the mare breathed visible clouds into the gray air. The horses, Garrick said. How close is Cassidy? Aurelia looked at the mare. She had been working her for the past 2 weeks. Beyond what Wes had already done proper handling, groundwork, getting the mare accustomed to the weight and movement of a rider. Cassidy was responding well. Not perfectly, she still had opinions about certain things, but well. Close, Aurelia said. Another week, maybe 10 days. Could we move her in 8? She considered honestly. Probably. Carefully. There's a rancher in Carver County, Garrick said. Name of Douglas Hatch. He's been looking for a trained quarter-horse mare for his daughter. He'll pay real money for quality stock, not what you'd get at a local sale. She looked at him. How do you know Douglas Hatch? I worked 3 months for him in '86. He's a straight dealer. How much? For a mare in Cassidy's condition with her breeding. I'd say $60 if we present her right. $60. She did the arithmetic in her head quickly, the way she had always done it, against what Clement Price needed to keep the filing active, against what a contested water survey would cost in response filings, against $2 and some cents. $60 was not enough to win. But $60 was the difference between holding on and not holding on. 8 days, she said. She worked the mare twice a day from that morning. Morning sessions for the technical work proper response to leg pressure, consistent gait transitions, working through the areas where Cassidy still had her opinions. Evening sessions lighter, building familiarity and trust. Wes helped without being asked, adjusting his own schedule around hers, occasionally saying something quietly useful about what he was observing in the mare's responses. On the 5th day, something in Cassidy settled. Not completely, the mare would always have a particular quality of aliveness that made her interesting and occasionally inconvenient. But the resistance that had been there since the beginning, the guardedness of an animal that had been left alone too long, resolved into something more like conversation. She still had thoughts about things. She just started accepting that some of them could be negotiated. On the 6th day, while Aurelia was putting the mare through her paces in the field, she became aware of someone watching from the road. She finished the session before she looked. It was a woman on a dark horse, standing at the edge of the property. Middle-aged, well-dressed, with the kind of posture that comes from riding a long time. She was watching Cassidy the way someone who knows horses watches a horse they are interested in. Aurelia rode to the fence. "Can I help you?" she said. "Are you Aurelia Fenwick?" The woman asked. "I am. My name is Greta Hatch. My husband is Douglas Hatch, out of Carver County." The woman looked at Cassidy with an appraiser's eye. "We heard you might have a mare worth seeing." Aurelia looked at Greta Hatch's face, at the quality of her horse, at the way she held her reins. Then she looked back at Garrick, who was working at the barn, and either had not noticed or was doing an excellent impression of not noticing. "That man by the barn," she said. "He worked for your husband in '86. Greta Hatch's expression shifted into something more direct. "He wrote Douglas a letter last week," she said. "Douglas would have come himself, but he's been laid up with a knee. He sent me." She paused. "He trusts my judgment on horses more than his own." "He's a wise man," Aurelia said. Greta Hatch smiled for the first time, brief and genuine. Occasionally, she looked at Cassidy again. "Let me see her move." She saw. The negotiation that followed was brief because Greta Hatch was the kind of person who decided what something was worth and said so without theater. She offered 55. Aurelia said 60. They settled at 58, which was a number neither of them had suggested, and which both of them accepted as fair, which was how good negotiations ended. When Greta Hatch rode away with a bill of sale in her pocket and would return in 4 days with the payment and arrange transport, Aurelia stood at the fence with her hand on the post and felt the particular combination of relief and something adjacent to grief that came from selling an animal you had put real work into. Wes came up beside her. "She'll be all right," he said. "Hatch Outfit is a good place." "I know. Cassidy'll like having a job." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment. "We still have the gray and the third mare." "We do. I think the gray is actually better," he said. "She just takes longer to trust." Aurelia looked at the field where the gray stood, watching them with her characteristic expression of mild suspicion toward the general project of human existence. She thought about what Wes had said about the gray weeks ago, on the first morning, that she wasn't mean, just scared, and that those were different things requiring different handling. She thought about Cal Sutter in Millhaven, sitting on records he was afraid to use. She thought about the water rights survey and the 2 men who had come to tell her about it in the language of someone observing something they were considering taking. She thought about Vernon Slade, who had built 6 years of small adjustments before he made his move, and who was now watching her from a distance she could not quite close. "The hard freeze is going to come early this year," she said, looking at the sky. It had the white flat quality again that she had been noticing for days. "I can feel it." Wes looked at the sky too. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Neither of them said what that meant for the barn, for the remaining horses, for the structure that was solid but not solid enough for a genuinely hard Montana winter. They both understood it. It sat between them in the cold air like something neither of them wanted to name yet, because naming it would make it immediate, and they had enough immediate things. What came 3 nights later was not what either of them had been watching for. It started as wind, which was ordinary. Then the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours, which was not ordinary. Then the snow came, not the clean, quiet snowfall that looked peaceful in illustrations, but the sideways-driven kind that found every gap in every structure and made the cold personal and specific and relentless. Aurelia was awake before midnight. She did not need to look outside to know what was happening. She could hear it. In the particular sound, the barn was making a low working groan in the rafters. The sound of a structure responding to load it was managing but not comfortably. She had the lantern lit and when Garrick opened the cabin door from outside, already dressed. Barn roof, he said. I know. Snow loads building on the west section. That patching I did in October, I know. She was already moving past him. Where are the children? Wes is already in the barn. Nell and Perry are staying in the wagon. Perry's 7. Perry's with Nell and Nell knows what to do. Come on. The world outside the cabin door was not a place that invited standing still in it. The wind hit like something with intent, and the snow was the driven horizontal kind that went immediately into eyes and collar and under hat brims. Aurelia bent her head into it and moved. The barn interior was a different kind of chaos. The noise of the storm was amplified by the structure. The horses were communicating their unhappiness clearly, and the lantern Wes had hung from the center beam was swinging in the drafts that came through the gaps. The west section of the roof was making a sound she did not like, a deep rhythmic creaking that meant the load was moving. The support beam, she said to Garrick over the noise. It needs shoring. I need another post under it. South corner, there's salvage timber. Show me, she showed him. It was not simple. The timber was buried under equipment that needed moving first, and moving it in a barn full of stressed horses in a storm, by lantern light, was the kind of work that went wrong in small ways constantly. A rope dropped. A horse shifted suddenly. Wes moved with the animals, keeping himself between them and the chaos the way he instinctively did. At some point, Perry appeared. He had apparently found his way from the wagon without telling Nell, which Nell had apparently then pursued him to explain her position on, and now both of them were in the barn doorway, Nell furious and Perry unconcerned. Go back, Aurelia said. The wagon was moving, Perry said. The wind was moving it. She looked at Garrick. He was already maneuvering the timber into position, his face set with the focused expression he wore when something had to work. Keep them in the far corner, she told Nell, away from the horses. Nell grabbed Perry's sleeve and pulled him to the far corner, looking at the roof the whole time, with an expression that was too old for her face. The work took 2 hours. Not elegant hours of slipping and misjudging angles and cold hands that didn't grip the way hands were supposed to, of Garrick swearing under his breath at a brace that kept shifting, of Wes, talking to the horses in the low constant voice he used with them, of the roof, making sounds that periodically caused everyone in the barn to stop and look up. The second support post went into place at the 3rd hour of the morning. They stood and listened to the roof. The creaking changed quality. Not gone, but different. Better. Garrick put both hands on the post and pushed, testing it. It held. That'll do, he said, and the flatness in his voice was the flatness of someone who has been doing something very hard for a long time and has reached the end of the hard part but is too tired to feel anything definite about it. Aurelia looked at the horses, who were calmer now that the adults were calmer. The gray had her head down. The third mare, the plain-looking roan they'd gotten from Garrick's contact, was leaning against the stall partition with the expression of an animal that had decided the whole enterprise was beneath her dignity. She looked at Perry in the corner, asleep sitting against the barn wall with Nell's coat over him, Nell beside him awake, and still watching the roof with the ledger instinct cataloging, assessing. She looked at Wes, who was running his hand along the gray mare's neck, checking for anything the stress of the night had revealed. She looked at Garrick, who was looking at her. The post will hold through the rest of the storm, he said. I need to replace the whole west section come spring. I know. We also need proper insulation on that east section of the cabin before the next hard freeze. I know that too. He looked around the barn, at the held roof, at the horses that had made it through the night, at his sleeping son and his watchful daughter. We held, he said. It wasn't triumph. It was just an observation, delivered in the quiet way he delivered things that mattered. She looked at him. At the exhaustion in his face and the reliability behind it, the specific quality she had been noticing in him for months, that he did not leave when things got hard, not because he was obligated, but because it genuinely did not occur to him as an option. We held, she said. Outside, the storm was still going, the wind still making its argument against everything they had built. But the barn was standing, the horses were safe, and the post Garrick had driven into the floor in the worst hours of the night was holding the weight of everything above it without complaint. It was not the kind of morning Aurelia Fenwick had once been accustomed to. But standing in it, in her ruined boots and her ice-crusted coat, watching daylight begin to touch the cracks in the barn walls with thin, cold light, she could not have said with any honesty that she wanted to be somewhere else. The storm left 14 inches of snow on the Bleecker parcel and a silence afterward that felt almost physical. The kind of quiet that comes after something loud has been going on long enough that the absence of it is its own sound. Aurelia spent the first morning after clearing the barn doorway, checking the post Garrick had driven in during the worst hours, walking the fence line to assess what the storm had done to it. 2 sections needed repair. The roof patch on the east cabin wall had held, which surprised her slightly, and which she took as information about Garrick's work rather than luck. The neighboring ranchers who came that day did not come to help. They came because they had seen the storm hit the Bleecker Ridge hard and expected to find something collapsed. 3 of them rode up together, mid-morning men she recognized, men she had known in the years when she was someone they were careful to stay on good terms with. Hollis Crane, who ran cattle on the north end of the valley. Ben Murtaugh, whose family had been in Silver Basin almost as long as hers. A third man named Garrett she knew less well, who had bought a small place near the creek 2 years before. They stopped their horses at the fence line and looked at the barn, at the cabin, at the cleared yard, and the horses visible in the field. She walked out to meet them. Aurelia, Hollis Crane said. He had the look of a man slightly disappointed by what he was finding. Not cruelly, just the specific expression of someone whose expectation has not been met. We heard the storm came down hard up here. It did, she said. We managed. Ben Murtaugh looked at the barn. Roof held? We put a support post under the west beam at about 2 in the morning. Held after that. He nodded slowly. His eyes moved across the yard in the assessing way of a cattleman who was involuntarily counting things. She watched him count the horses, the repaired fence sections, the cleared paths, the smoke coming from the cabin chimney, and she watched the count register as something he had not expected to see. Vernon said the storm would probably finish this place, Garrett said. He said it plainly, not maliciously, in the manner of someone repeating information that now appeared to be incorrect. Then he seemed to realize how it sounded and looked mildly uncomfortable. Vernon's been saying a lot of things, she said. Hollis Crane shifted in his saddle. He was a careful man. Hollis, she had always known that about him. He had not crossed the street when he saw her, but he had also not sent anyone out to ask whether she needed help after the storm, and those 2 things were related. He occupied the middle ground where most people in Silver Basin had positioned themselves, not openly against her, not willing to be seen standing with her either. The horses, he said, with the slight formality of someone changing the subject to something safer. Those the mares from the south field? 2 of them. Third is a roan we brought in. Wes Boone's working them, Ben Murtaugh said, which surprised her. She had not known her arrangement with the Boones had traveled. I heard that from somebody in town. He is. Good hand with horses, they're saying. Better than good, she said. There was a pause. The 3 men looked at the horses in the field. The gray was moving along the fence with her characteristic quality of alertness, the roan standing solid, both of them well past the condition they had been in 2 months before. The sale of Cassidy had bought the grain that was showing in these animals now. Hollis Crane said, Clement Price has been filing regularly. I know, he represents me. Vernon's attorneys have been responding to every filing. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. It's going to come to a county hearing eventually. You know that. That's the point, Hollis. He rubbed the side of his face. She had known him 12 years, and she knew that gesture. It was the gesture of a man working through a calculation that involved more variables than he was comfortable with. If it comes to a hearing, he said carefully, and if it turns out there were irregularities in how that receivership was filed, a lot of people in this county would have stood by and watched it happen. She looked at him. She understood what he was doing. He was not offering support. He was positioning himself for the possibility that support might become the advantageous position, which was different. She had been in enough negotiations to know the difference. Yes, she said. They would have. He nodded once, uncomfortable with that plainness, and the 3 men rode out a few minutes later without having offered anything concrete. But they had come. Garrick was behind her when she turned. He had come up quietly, which she had accepted as one of his habits. He moved through spaces without announcing himself, not by intention but by nature. What was that? He asked. People watching which way the wind is blowing, she said. He looked at the retreating horses. What direction is it blowing? Undecided. She walked back toward the cabin. But the fact that they came at all means Vernon's account of what's happening out here isn't matching what they can see with their own eyes. He told them the storm would finish this place. And it didn't. And it didn't. She stopped at the cabin door. That's the kind of thing people notice. When what someone tells them doesn't match what they see. Inside, Nell had breakfast on the stove. Perry was at the table drawing something on the back of an old supply list with a piece of charcoal, a project he had been committed to since early morning. Wes was not inside, which meant he was with the horses, which was where he usually was when he was not required elsewhere. Garrick sat down across from Perry and looked at the drawing. What is that? Perry held it up. The ranch, he said. The whole thing. This part is us. He pointed to a section of the drawing. And this part is the big one. He pointed to another section connected to it, larger. They're going to be connected. Garrick looked at the drawing, then at Aurelia. She looked at Perry's drawing, the two sections connected by a line the boy had drawn, with complete confidence in the arrangement. You've been talking to Nell, she said to Perry. Nell says the water goes from here to there, he said, pointing. She showed me on a map she made. He went back to his drawing. So they're already connected. We just need the paper to say so. Nell at the stove did not look up from the eggs she was moving around the pan. I was explaining geography, she said. Not making promises. It's not a promise, Perry said comfortably. It's just what's going to happen. Aurelia sat down at the table. She was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been tired for months and had stopped expecting not to be. She looked at Perry's drawing, the two sections of land connected by a line. The letter from Cal Sutter arrived 4 days later. She had not expected a letter. She had expected silence, or possibly a message through Clement Price that Cal had decided not to get involved after all, which was the more likely outcome for a frightened man with a family in Millhaven. People who thought about risk long enough almost always decided the risk was too large. But the letter came, delivered by a writer Cal had apparently paid privately rather than trusting the postal route, which told her something about how seriously he was taking the question of who might see it. She read it at the table with Garrick across from her and Nell pretending to work on the ledger while clearly listening. Cal had done something she had not asked him to do, and which it had apparently taken him several weeks and considerable internal argument to decide on. He had gone back to a contact he had from his bookkeeping days, a man named Emmett Dawes, who had worked as a records clerk at the Golden Lark before Aurelia had changed suppliers for her grain operation. Emmett was retired now, living in a small place outside Silver Basin. Cal had asked Emmett, in a carefully worded letter, whether he still had any of the original ranch ledgers from his time there. Emmett did. Not all of them, but 4 complete ledgers from the period when the adjustments Cal had identified first appeared, which he had apparently kept out of some combination of professional habit and vague unease that had never resolved into a specific reason to have kept them. Cal's letter closed with the information that Emmett Dawes was 71 years old, had no particular loyalty to Vernon Slade, and had said to Cal, apparently verbatim, "I always thought that man had a smell about him." She set the letter down. Emmett Dawes, Garrick said. He was at Golden Lark 8 years ago for about 3 seasons. Careful man. Good memory. She was already thinking through what the ledgers would show if they matched what Cal had documented, if they showed the original entries before Vernon's alterations. If those 4 ledgers have the original numbers before the adjustments, and we can put them next to Cal's copies we have before and after. That's evidence of alteration, Garrick said. That's evidence of systematic falsification over time. She looked at the letter again, which is a different and much larger thing than a single forged signature. Nell set down her pencil. Does Mr. Price know? He will by tomorrow morning. Aurelia folded the letter. I need to get to Emmett Dawes before Vernon finds out there's a reason to visit him. She rode to Emmett Dawes's place the next morning, early enough that the sun was barely showing over the ridge. The man's property was modest, a small house, a good-sized garden plot under its winter covering of straw, a single horse in a well-kept pen. He answered the door before she knocked, which meant he had heard her coming and had been expecting her. He was a small, neat man with white hair and the precise movements of someone who had spent a working life handling documents and had carried the habit of exactness into retirement. Aurelia Fenwick, he said. You look like you've had a hard few months. I have, she said. Can I come in? He stepped back and let her in. His front room had a table with papers on it that he had clearly been organizing before she arrived, and she recognized the format immediately: the Golden Lark ledger structure, the column headers she had designed herself. He had laid them out for her. She sat down and went through them carefully. He sat across the table and watched her the way people watch someone reading something important, not interrupting, not rushing, understanding that the reading needed to happen at its own speed. The original entries were exactly as she had kept them. She recognized the hand of the clerks who had worked for her, recognized the categories and the notation system, recognized the numbers that matched her memory of what Golden Lark had actually cost to run. She put Cal's copies beside them. The differences were visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at, and she had spent 11 years looking at exactly this kind of record. The adjustments Vernon had made to Cal's reconciled copies were small but consistent amounts nudged, categories shifted, expense totals slightly inflated in the specific columns that would affect a debt-to-asset calculation. Over the period of months Cal had documented, the cumulative effect was to make Golden Lark appear to be carrying significantly more operational debt than it actually was. Not enough to justify $11,000. That number was the forged loan. But the ledger adjustments were the scaffolding that made the forged loan plausible, and operation already appearing to struggle would be believable as one that had needed to seek bank financing. She looked at Emmett Dawes. "You kept these because something bothered you," she said. "When Vernon took over the supply ordering in my last season there, the numbers started feeling wrong," he said. "Not obviously wrong, just wrong the way a door feels wrong when it's settled off plumb. You lean on it and something in your shoulder tells you before your eyes do." He folded his hands on the table. "I was going to retire anyway. I didn't know enough to make a case, and I had no reason to go looking for trouble." He paused. "But I kept the ledgers. Would you be willing to testify to what you saw? Not what you suspected, what you actually observed in the numbers during your time at Golden Lark." He looked at her for a moment. He was a quiet man deciding something quietly. "Vernon Slade is going to be very unhappy about this," he said. "Yes, he has resources. I know." He looked at the ledgers on his table. "I'm 71, he said. "I have a garden. I have this house. I've lived a careful life because I was always afraid of exactly this kind of situation." He stopped. "I'm tired of being afraid of it. I've been afraid of it for 8 years, and it didn't actually protect anything except my own discomfort." She waited. "I'll talk to your attorney," he said. She rode back to the Bleecker parcel with the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth in her saddlebag, and the careful knowledge that she had something now that she had not had before. Not enough, not yet, but the beginning of a shape to the case that had been, until now, a claim supported mostly by her own certainty. The conversation she needed to have with Clement Price happened the next morning, in his small office above the saddle shop, and it was the most useful 2 hours she had spent with an attorney in her professional life. Price went through the ledgers with the deliberate attention of a man who had been practicing law long enough to know when something was significant and not to get excited about it prematurely. Emmett Dawes' testimony combined with Cal Sutter's documentation, he said, not looking up from the pages, establishes a pattern of intentional alteration to financial records associated with Golden Lark Ranch over a period of approximately 8 months. Yes. That pattern supports the argument that the debt claim against Golden Lark was built on falsified evidence of financial distress. Yes, it doesn't prove the forged signature directly. I know that. She had been clear on this from the beginning. But the billings timeline does. I have hotel records, a dated purchase receipt, and the names of 6 witnesses who can confirm I was 300 miles away when the document was supposedly signed. He set the ledgers down and looked at her over his glasses. What I can file for is a formal county hearing to challenge the receivership on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. The evidence we now have is sufficient to require a response from Vernon Slade and the First Territorial Bank's attorneys. They cannot simply let a hearing request of this substance sit unanswered. That's what I want, she said. A public hearing, not a private negotiation. He looked at her. A private negotiation would be faster. I know it would be. A public hearing means Vernon's attorneys will challenge every piece of evidence. Emmett Dawes' memory will be questioned. Cal Sutter's copies will be questioned. Your timeline evidence will be questioned. It will not be clean. Nothing about this has been clean, she said. But private negotiations with Vernon Slade produce private outcomes. I don't want a private outcome. I want the county to see what happened. Price was quiet for a moment. There's a personal risk in that, he said carefully. If the hearing doesn't go well, then I've lost in public instead of in private, and I'm no worse off than I am now. She looked at him. File for the hearing. He filed that afternoon. Within 48 hours, Aurelia received word, through the same sideways channels that information moved in Silver Basin, that Vernon had dismissed 2 of the Golden Lark workers who had remained after the seizure men who had been there since before Aurelia had hired Vernon, who knew the operation and its history, and presumably its records. The dismissals were dressed in language about winter staffing reductions, but the timing was not coincidental. He was reducing the number of people who could speak to what they knew. She told Garrick that evening. He was working on saddle leather at the table, a piece of repair work he had been doing slowly for a week, and he set it down when she told him. He's cleaning house, Garrick said, selectively. She sat across from him. The 2 men he dismissed, I know both of them. One of them, a man named Foster Dean, was the head hand when I ran the operation. He's been there 12 years. Would Dean talk to Price? I don't know. He's a careful man. He has a family. She thought about Cal Sutter, about Emmett Dawes, about the particular weight of being the person who knew something and had to decide what to do about knowing it. But he was there for years before Vernon arrived. He knows what the operation looked like before and what it looked like after. Reach out to him, Garrick said. I'm going to. She looked at the leather work on the table, at the careful, methodical repair. Vernon made a mistake with Dean. If you've been loyal to an operation for 12 years and the new man dismisses you to keep you quiet, you tend to form an opinion about the new man. Wes appeared in the doorway from the back room, which meant he had been listening, which she had come to accept as a general characteristic of the household. The Boone children listened to adult conversations the way attentive children did, in families where adult conversations had always mattered, where the information in them affected their lives directly. Mr. Dean, Wes said. Is he the tall one who used to ride the boundary fence on the north? Aurelia looked at him. You've seen Foster Dean? He came by once, about 6 weeks ago, when I was in the south field with the gray. Wes leaned against the doorframe. He stopped on the road and watched for a while. I figured he was just curious. He didn't say anything. She thought about that. A man who had worked Golden Lark for 12 years, watching what she was building on the 80-acre parcel from a distance. Not approaching, not making contact, just watching. Was he alone, she asked. Just him. She looked at Garrick. He looked back. He's been watching, she said. Seems like. She went to Foster Dean's place 2 days later, at a time she calculated he would be home, and unlikely to have company late morning on a weekday. The particular hour when a man recently dismissed from a job he had held for 12 years would be doing something with his hands to avoid thinking about what had happened. She found him splitting wood behind his house, which was exactly where she expected him to be. He stopped when he saw her coming. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been expecting a conversation he was not sure he wanted to have. Aurelia, he said. He set the axe down, not leaning it against the chopping block, but setting it down properly, which she recognized as the habit of a careful man. Foster. She stopped a few feet away. She did not approach the way you approach someone you need something from. She stood where she was, equal distance, and let him decide the terms of it. You've had a hard month. His jaw tightened slightly. Winter staffing reductions, he said. The words were flat and did not include any belief in themselves. That's what he told you. That's what the paper said. She looked at him. He was a large man somewhere in his late 40s, with the weathered face of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life, and the particular kind of dignity that came from being very good at a thing for a very long time. Being dismissed from that thing, for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of his work, sat on him visibly. You were there before Vernon, she said. 11 years before him. He picked up the axe and set it against the block after all. He needed something to do with his hands. I helped you build half of what's on that property. I know you did. He looked at her. What are you asking me? I'm asking whether you saw anything. During the time Vernon was operating the ranch, that didn't match what you knew the operation to be. In the accounts, in the purchase records, in anything that went through the management office. He was quiet for a long moment. A crow called somewhere behind the house, and the wind moved through the bare trees, and Foster Dean stood in his own yard with 12 years of work and a December dismissal, and looked at her. There was a set of livestock valuations, he said carefully, from the spring before last. Vernon had me countersign them as the head-hand standard practice, having a witness. I signed them. He paused. 3 months later, I saw the same valuations in a document he was preparing for the bank. The numbers were different. Different how? Lower. He held her gaze. The animals were valued lower in the bank document than in the originals I'd signed, by a significant amount. Her chest did something quiet and controlled. Would you know those original valuations if you saw them again? I countersigned them, he said. I remember what I put my name to. Clement Price is my attorney, she said. He's filed for a county hearing. I know. The whole valley knows. He looked past her toward the distant ridge where Golden Lark's roofline was barely visible in the winter light. 12 years, he said. It wasn't addressed to her specifically. I know. He was quiet again. She gave him the quiet because she had learned over years of negotiations that filling quiet with persuasion usually closed things off instead of opening them. A person who was going to decide a hard thing needed to do it in their own time. I'll talk to Price, Foster Dean said. I'm not making any commitment beyond that, but I'll talk to him. That's all I'm asking. She rode back in weather that had gone gray and spitting again, and she thought about what she had. Clement Price with a hearing request filed. Cal Sutter with his copies of the altered reconciliation entries. Emmett Dawes with the original ledgers that showed the numbers before Vernon touched them. Foster Dean with personal knowledge of falsified livestock valuations and his own countersignature on the originals. Her own billings timeline documented. Each piece by itself was insufficient. Together, they were beginning to form something. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of February, which gave them approximately 9 weeks. Price told her this in a message that was careful and precise and not optimistic. He did not need to explain why she understood the territory. Vernon's attorneys would challenge every witness. The bank's attorneys would argue that the receivership had been conducted lawfully. The county hearing officer would be a man named Sheridan Bates, who had been in his position for 14 years and whose relationship with the First Territorial Bank was well established without being technically compromised. She told Garrick all of this the evening the message came. He listened, then said, "What does Price think our actual odds are?" He didn't say. "What do you think they are?" She looked at the table. At Nell's ledger open to the current page. At the numbers that told the story of 5 months of building something from nothing. At the small margin they were still operating on. Better than they were, she said. Not good, he nodded. He accepted this the way he accepted most difficult information directly, without spending energy on not wanting it to be true. Then we make them better, he said. The weeks between the filing and the hearing were the kind that aged people. The cold deepened the way it did in Montana when winter stopped being seasonal and became simply the condition of existence. The horses required constant attention. The cabin required constant management. The legal work required constant communication with Price, who was methodical and thorough and consumed money, at a rate that kept Nell's ledger balanced on attention neither of them commented on directly. Wes worked the gray mare through all of it, quietly, consistently, the way he worked everything. She had come to something that might generously be called trust, not complete, not unconditional, but genuine. She let him ride her. She had opinions about it. She expressed the opinions clearly, and he listened and they negotiated, which was the only relationship with a horse worth having. One evening in late January, Wes came in from the barn with an expression she had learned to read as meaning he had been thinking about something for a while and had decided to say it. He sat at the table and looked at the space between his hands. The gray, he said. She's ready to show. Aurelia looked up from the document she had been reviewing. Show where? Hollis Crane came by today while you were in town. He said it without looking at her, which meant he knew the information had weight. He asked about her. Not casual, he was looking at her, the way someone looks when they're considering purchasing. She set down the document. Hollis Crane came here. Just him, alone. Wes finally looked up. He watched me work her for about 20 minutes. Then he asked what her background was and how she'd been handled and whether she was for sale. She thought about Hollis Crane on the road outside the fence 3 months ago, watching without committing. About Ben Murtaugh counting things with his cattleman's eye. About the calculation Silver Basin had been making about which way to look. What did you tell him, she asked. That I didn't know if she was for sale. That I'd have to ask you. He paused. He said to tell you he might also have some questions for you about the hearing. The room was quiet. Perry was drawing at the other end of the table. Nell was at the stove. Garrick was somewhere outside. Questions about the hearing from Hollis Crane, who knew everyone in Silver Basin, who had been in the valley since before Golden Lark existed, whose opinion carried weight the way established things always did. "Tell him to come by Sunday," she said. Hollis Crane came Sunday, and this time he came inside. They sat at the rough table in the cabin that was warmer now than it had been in September, better sealed, no longer leaning in the east wall. She had not prepared anything special for the meeting. She served him coffee from the same tin cups they used themselves and put the ledger on the table where he could see it if he looked. He looked at it. "Nell keeps that," she said. "Every dollar in and out since we started on this place." He looked at the current page, at the numbers, at the categories, at the way the columns were precise and the running total was honest about where things stood. "Your attorney filed for a hearing," he said. "Yes. Sheridan Bates is the hearing officer." "I know." "Bates is careful." Hollis Crane said it without any particular inflection, which meant it was carrying inflection that he preferred not to make explicit. He pays attention to what the community believes about a situation. "I'm aware of how Bates operates," she said. Hollis looked at his coffee. "A lot of people in this county have been waiting to see whether you were going to last the winter." "I know that too. You lasted it. We lasted it," she said. "There's a distinction." He looked around the cabin briefly at the repaired walls, the working stove, the evidence of sustained occupation and labor. Then he looked at the door, beyond which Wes was presumably in the field with the horses, and Nell was doing something methodical somewhere, and Perry was being Perry. "Garrick Boone is a straight man," Hollis said. "Not a question." "He is." "Where'd he come from?" "Wyoming, before that Colorado." "He lost a cattle operation after his wife died." She looked at Crane directly. "He came through Silver Basin, with 3 children and a wagon, and stopped when he saw what was happening out here. Stopped because he saw a situation he could work. If that's what it was, he's had an extremely poor return on his judgment," she said, "because we have had almost nothing, and he has worked through it without complaint and without leaving." She paused. "You can decide for yourself what that means." Hollis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The gray mare." $90, she said. "She's worth more. But I want her to go to someone in this county who will be seen working her." He looked at her. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I know what it means for you to purchase a horse from this property right now. And I know what it means in the valley when Hollis Crane is seen with an animal he bought from Aurelia Fenwick." It was the most direct thing she had ever said to him in 12 years of knowing each other. She watched it land on his face, watched him absorb that she was not pretending it was just a horse transaction. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "She really that good?" he finally said. "Wes Boone put 2 months into her," Aurelia said. "She'll work better than anything you have in that string. And you'll know it in the first hour you ride her." He bought the gray. He paid $90, cash, which was real money, which went into Nell's ledger under horse income in the column Aurelia had told her to open 3 months earlier. Wes brought the mare out, and Hollis rode her around the field once and came back with an expression that said everything that needed saying about the quality of the work that had been put into the animal. He looked at Wes with a directness that was its own kind of respect. "Good work," he said. Wes nodded once. It was enough. Hollis Crane left with the gray, and what he took with him, besides the horse, was visible in the way he rode out upright, deliberate, on a horse purchased from a woman he had been carefully not standing beside for 5 months. That was on a Thursday. By Sunday, 2 other neighboring ranchers had sent word that they had questions about the remaining horse stock and about the Bleecker parcel's spring grazing arrangements. By Monday, Foster Dean had sent a message to Clement Price. By Tuesday afternoon, Wes was in the south field working the roan mare when he stopped what he was doing and came to the fence at a deliberate pace that was not hurried but had something behind it. "There's a wagon coming up from the south road," he said. "Old man driving it. He's got crates in the back that look like record boxes." Aurelia stood and looked at the road. The wagon was slow, and the horse pulling it was old, and the man holding the reins had white hair and the precise posture of someone accustomed to handling things carefully. Emmett Dawes had brought the original ledgers himself. He should have sent them with a rider, Garrick said from behind her. He wanted to deliver them himself, she said. She understood it without having to think about it long. He kept them for 8 years waiting for a reason to matter. He wanted to put them in someone's hands himself. She walked out to meet the wagon. Emmett Dawes climbed down from the seat with the careful movement of a 71-year-old man who had driven 11 miles in January cold and was feeling it in his knees. And he reached into the wagon bed and lifted out the oilcloth-wrapped package of ledgers and held it toward her. "I thought about mailing these," he said. "Then I thought, they've been in my house for 8 years. I've been careful with them for 8 years. I'll see them the rest of the way myself." She took the package. It was heavier than it looked, the way important things sometimes were. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He came inside, and Nell immediately brought him coffee without being asked. And Perry looked at the old man with the frank curiosity he brought to everything, and asked him how old his horse was. And Emmett Dawes answered with the seriousness the question deserved. And for a little while the cabin was full of the ordinary noise of people in a small space together. Clement Price came the next morning and sat at the rough table and went through the original ledgers against Cal Sutter's copies for 3 hours. She sat with him. Garrick came in and out. Nell kept the stove going and worked on her own ledger at the other end of the table with the focused detachment of a girl who understood she was in the presence of something important and had decided the most useful thing she could do was stay out of the way and keep the room warm. When Price finally set down the last page, he was quiet for a moment. "This is sufficient," he said. Not enthusiastic, not dramatic. Just sufficient. The word of a careful man who meant it precisely. "For the hearing?" she asked. "For the hearing." Combined with Dean's testimony regarding the livestock valuations, Sutter's documentation, and your timeline evidence from Billings, yes. He straightened the pages. Vernon Slade's attorneys are going to come at every one of these witnesses. They're going to argue chain of custody on the ledgers, credibility on Sutter, memory on Dean, coincidence on the timeline. "Let them argue," she said. He looked at her. "You understand this still isn't certain." "I understand that." He gathered his papers. "The hearing is in 4 weeks. After he left, she stood in the cabin for a moment in the quiet after the door closed. The stove ticked. Outside, she could hear Wes's voice with the roan, the particular low register he used. That meant they were in a good session. Garrick found somewhere splitting wood. She could hear the axe, at intervals, the regular sound of it. Nell came to stand beside her, looking at nothing in particular. "He said sufficient," Nell said. "He did. That's a careful word. He's a careful man. But it means yes." Aurelia looked at her at the 11-year-old girl, who had started a ledger at 9 because she wanted to understand what things cost, who had kept the accounts of this entire endeavor with a precision that never flinched at hard numbers. "It means yes," she said. Nell went back to her ledger and made a notation that Aurelia didn't look at. She found out later what it said. Nell had written, in the margin beside the date, "Price says sufficient. 4 weeks to hearing." And below that, in smaller letters, "The numbers are on our side." She was right. But 4 weeks was still 4 weeks, and Vernon Slade was not a man who accepted the direction of things without attempting to change them. What came next came from the last place Aurelia would have thought to look. What came from the last place Aurelia would have thought to look came from Wes. Not from an attorney, not from a witness, not from any of the careful legal architecture Clement Price had been building. It came from a 14-year-old boy who had spent a January afternoon helping a retired bookkeeper fix a wagon wheel because the man had stopped on the road with a broken spoke, and Wes had been the first person to see it. The retired bookkeeper was named Harlan Cook. He had worked the Golden Lark accounts for 1 season, 7 years prior, before Aurelia had brought Cal Sutter on. Wes did not know any of this when he stopped to help. He stopped because a wheel was broken and someone needed help with it, which was the only reason required. Harlan Cook, it turned out, had not destroyed his personal copies of the work he had done at Golden Lark. He had kept them in a tin box under a floorboard because he was a man who kept things, and because something about his single season at the ranch had never sat entirely right with him, and because he had never had a clear reason to bring it forward, and had therefore never quite been able to throw it away. He gave Wes the tin box to bring to Aurelia. Wes carried it home under his arm and set it on the table and said, simply, "Man on the road had this." Said it might be useful. Inside the tin box were records from a period that predated even Emmett Dawes's ledgers, the earliest phase of Vernon's management, before Vernon had fully understood which records would matter and which ones he could afford to let remain accurate, before he had learned to be careful. The entries in Harlan Cook's copies were not adjusted. They were original. And they showed, with the clarity of numbers recorded before anyone thought to falsify them, that Golden Lark had been operating at a comfortable surplus for every season Aurelia had run it, including the season Vernon had later documented as the beginning of the ranch's financial difficulties. Clement Price looked at those records for a long time at the hearing. Then he put them in front of Sheridan Bates and did not say anything dramatic. He simply explained what they were, who had kept them, how they had been preserved, and what they showed when placed beside Vernon's version of the same period. The discrepancy was not subtle. Vernon's attorneys challenged everything, the way Price had said they would. They challenged the chain of custody on the ledgers. They challenged Harlan Cook's memory and his motivation. They challenged Cal Sutter's copies and Emmett Dawes's originals and Foster Dean's recollection of the livestock valuations he had countersigned. What they could not challenge was the arithmetic. 3 independent sets of records, kept by 3 different men at 3 different points in time, all showing the same. Numbers that contradicted Vernon Slade's account of Golden Lark's finances at every significant point. And the Billings timeline, her hotel receipt, the dated purchase record, the names of the 6 witnesses Price had managed to locate and depose, 2 of whom appeared at the hearing in person. Sheridan Bates was a careful man. He took 4 days after the hearing before he issued his ruling, which was longer than anyone had expected, and which those 4 days were some of the hardest Aurelia had spent. Since the morning she found her gate padlocked. She did not sleep well. She did not pretend to. She sat by the stove at night, and Garrick sometimes sat with her, and sometimes didn't, and when he did, they did not always talk. Sometimes sitting beside someone in the dark without talking was its own kind of support, the kind that did not ask anything of either person. On the 4th day, Price sent a writer. The ruling was 4 pages. The legal language was dense and careful, and when she got to the operative conclusion, her eyes moved over it twice before the meaning settled fully. The receivership was declared fraudulent. The debt documents were voided. The liens against Golden Lark Ranch were dissolved. The property was to be returned to its lawful owner, Aurelia Fenwick, within 30 days. Weston Drury's bank was referred to the territorial attorney for investigation of its role in the fraudulent filing. Vernon Slade was referred to the same office for criminal fraud charges. She sat with the ruling in her hands for a while. Then she went outside. Garrick was at the fence. He turned when he heard the door. She held up the papers. He looked at her face, not the papers. He crossed the yard and took the ruling from her and read it. He read slowly, the way he did most things, not because he was slow, but because he did not like to misread something important. When he finished, he handed it back. 30 days, he said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. How do you feel? It was a question she had not expected, which was probably why it was the right one to ask. She thought about it honestly. Strange, she said. I thought I'd feel I don't know. Larger than this. She looked at the ruling in her hand. Mostly I just feel tired. He nodded like that made sense. You've been carrying it a long time, 8 months. That's a long time. She looked at the Bleecker parcel, at the cabin with its repaired east wall, at the barn that had survived the winter storm, at the roan in the field, the one horse remaining now that Cassidy was in Carver County, and the gray was with Hollis Crane, at the well pump that Garrick had made ugly and functional from salvaged iron. I need to go back, she said. I need to ride over there and see it. Do you want company? She thought about that. No, not yet. He accepted that without argument. She rode to Golden Lark alone in the early afternoon. The gate was still chained, but that was a temporary condition now the law said so. She stood at it for a moment, looking through it at the main house, and the outbuildings, and the paddocks she had built, and the fence lines she had walked 100 times. It looked like hers. It had always looked like hers. She thought about the woman who had stood at this gate 8 months ago, with a lien notice in her hand and nowhere to sleep. She had been so certain that getting back to this gate was the whole thing, that if she could undo what Vernon had done, she would be returned to herself. She had been wrong about that, and she was only now understanding how wrong. The woman who had lived inside that house had built something impressive and had done it largely alone, and had been proud of doing it alone, and had not fully understood what that aloneness cost until a battered wagon stopped beside her, and a man with 3 children, and no money asked what needed building first. She rode back. The children were outside when she returned. Perry was attempting to teach the roan mare, something the mare clearly had no interest in learning. Nell was watching him from the fence, with the expression of someone witnessing an experiment whose outcome she had already calculated. Wes was near the barn, listening to Nell's running commentary on Perry's efforts with the detached amusement of an older brother. She dismounted and stood in the yard of the 80-acre parcel that nobody had thought worth stealing. "We got it back," she said. Perry looked at her. "The big one?" "The big one." He turned to the roan mare. "I told you," he said to the horse, as though the mare had expressed doubt about this outcome. Nell's expression did the thing it did when she was working out implications: a slight stillness, a focused quality. "Does that change things?" she asked. The question was direct and careful and was not really about the ranch. Aurelia looked at the girl. At the ledger she carried everywhere now, the record of 8 months of building something out of almost nothing. At Wes, who had stopped pretending not to listen. At Perry, who was watching her with the uncomplicated directness of a 7-year-old who expected a straight answer. "Come inside," she said. "All of you." Garrick was already there. He had started coffee, which was something he did when he expected a difficult conversation and wanted something for people's hands to hold. She sat at the rough table. The 4 Boones arranged themselves around it, Garrick across from her, Wes beside him, Nell and Perry on the bench. She looked at them. She had practiced what she intended to say. In her head, riding back from Golden Lark's gate, she had assembled reasonable language about partnership structures and legal arrangements, and the formal terms by which the Bleecker parcel could be permanently joined to Golden Lark under a shared operation. She had the vocabulary for it. She had made business arrangements her whole adult life. But looking at Garrick Boone across the rough table, at the face of a man who had driven a battered wagon onto a stranger's rocky land and simply started building, she found that the prepared language was not what came out. "I'm not going back to what I was," she said. "The woman who ran Golden Lark alone, she built something real. But she built it the wrong way, and what Vernon could do to her was partly because of that. Because alone is a kind of weak that doesn't look like weakness until someone decides to test it." Nobody said anything. She kept going. "I want to join this parcel to Golden Lark permanently. I want the operation to be ours, a real partnership, legally documented, equal standing." She looked at Garrick. "I want Wes running the horse program, because he is better at it than anyone I have ever seen. And he is 14. And by the time he is 20, there will not be a working horse operation in this territory that can match what he builds." Wes looked at the table and the back of his neck went slightly red, which was the closest she had ever seen him come to being flustered. "I want Nell keeping the books," she continued, "because Nell already keeps better books than most professional bookkeepers I have employed, and because she should be paid for it." Nell looked at the ledger in front of her and made no expression, which meant she was feeling something she had not decided whether to show yet. "And I want Perry to keep living in a house with enough room to make noise in," she said. Perry nodded seriously, as though this was a reasonable contractual term. She looked at Garrick last. He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, which was unusual. She had gotten reasonably good at reading him over 8 months. "I'm not offering you a job," she said. "I'm offering you a stake. Your name on the deed alongside mine. Equal say in what the operation does and how it grows." The room was quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the roan mare made a sound of mild complaint about something. "That's a significant offer," Garrick said. "I know what it is. You'd be giving half of something you fought 8 months to get back. I'd be giving half of something I couldn't have gotten back without you." She held his gaze. "And I'm not interested in the kind of partnership where I'm careful about what I give because I'm planning to keep the better part for myself. I've seen what that kind of arrangement produces. I lived it for 11 years. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his children, at Wes, who was now looking at his father with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite succeeding. At Nell, who had opened the ledger and was looking at it, not because she needed to, but because she needed something to do while she waited. At Perry, who was looking at Garrick with the simple expectation of someone who had already decided what the answer should be. "All right," Garrick said. Just that, all right. She had expected something harder to arrive at. "That's it," she said. "What else would I say?" He looked at her across the table. "I stopped on this road 8 months ago because there was a woman standing at a broken gate who clearly knew what she was doing and had been treated like she didn't matter. I wasn't looking for a half share of a ranch." He paused. "But I'm not going to pretend I don't want one." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Get Clement Price out here this week. I want the paperwork started before anything else can go wrong." The paperwork took 3 weeks. The return to Golden Lark happened on a Thursday in late March, When the ground was softening and the light was starting to come back the way Montana light came back slowly, then all at once, she rode in through the front gate with the Boones behind her. Not dramatically. Not with any ceremony she had planned. Garrick drove the wagon with the children, and they came through the gate that was no longer padlocked, past the house, where the former workers who had stayed on were waiting without knowing entirely what to expect. She stopped in the yard. She looked at the house, at the land, at all of it. Then she turned her horse and looked back at the wagon, at Garrick sitting on the bench with Perry beside him, at Nell in the wagon bed with the ledger she had already started labeling with the new operations heading, at Wes on his own horse off to the side. Looking at the property the way he looked at a horse, he was sizing up, not impressed by the size of it, just thinking about what it needed. She had thought, for 8 months, that coming back here would be the end of something, the completion of a thing that had been broken and needed to be repaired. But looking at the 4 of them, she understood that this was not an ending. It was just the first day of something that had already been built. In a leaning cabin on 80 acres of rock and scrub grass, in the dark hours of a winter storm, in a ledger kept by a girl who counted the cents because cents mattered. The old line cabin on the Bleecker parcel she kept standing. People would ask her about it for years, why a woman who owned one of the finest ranches in Silver Basin Valley preserved that ugly, patched, listing little structure out there in the south pasture. She never gave a long answer. She would just say, "That's where we started." What she meant, though she didn't always say all of it, was this. Vernon Slade had taken everything she thought she was. Her money, her position, her land, her workers, the life she had spent 11 years building. He had taken all of it believing that those things were her, that without them, she was nothing worth troubling about. He had been wrong about that, because what he could not take, and what no forged document could touch, was what happened when a battered wagon stopped on a rocky road, and a man with nothing to spare asked what needed building first. You cannot steal the people who choose to stand beside you when you have nothing left to offer them. You cannot put a lien on that. She had once thought rebuilding meant getting her old life back. What she got instead was something she would not have traded for the original, which had been grand and impressive and, in the end, too fragile to survive one man's slow and patient betrayal. What she got was Garrick, who was not a perfect man and did not pretend to be. Wes, who was going to surpass everyone around him and was already humble enough about it to be worth knowing. Nell, who counted the cents and wrote the margin notes and understood that numbers told stories if you knew how to read them. Perry, who had looked at a ruined cabin and said, "You just got to fix the crack," with the absolute confidence of someone who had not yet learned to doubt that simple things were possible. Golden Lark became more than a ranch after that. It became the place where all 5 of them lived imperfectly, sometimes loudly, occasionally in sharp disagreement about cattle prices or fence lines, or whether a particular horse was ready to show, and where the work was shared the way real work always should be, not divided up and assigned, but undertaken together by people who had already proven to each other, in the worst conditions they had, that they would not walk away. That was worth more than any deed. That was the thing that lasted.